Welcome to King's for the 22nd Strand Group event. My name is Eleanor Hallam. I'm part of the Strand Group team here. I work as a research assistant for our visiting professor Ed Balls, as well as doing my PhD on the Treasury and the management of the financial crisis. So the Strand Group is directed by Dr. John Davis, and we look at political leadership and machinery in government, both past and present, through our programme of academic research, master's level teaching and events such as today's mini conference. I would like to give a special thanks to DXC Technology. They are a new company formed from the merger of Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Services and CSC, which happened last month. I'd also like to give particular thanks to the City of London Corporation. It's the first event they've sponsored of ours here at King's, so we're really, really grateful to have them on board. And also to the Department of Political Economy, who have been friends of ours at the Strand Group since we've been here at King's. So today we're going to be looking at the Bank of England independence 20 years on. We're going to have two panel discussions. The first is going to be on the decision to make the Bank of England independent in 1997, and then the second is going to be looking at the Bank of England today. In between, we're going to have a coffee break, and afterwards we'll have a drinks reception, so plenty of opportunities for refreshments. So without further ado, I will pass over to our director, Dr. John Davis, who will be chairing the first panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just echo Eleanor's words? Very big thank you to our sponsors, DXC, in different guises. I think it's now about the 16th year that they've been sponsoring us. So a huge thank you to them. And City of London Corporation used to sponsor us in a previous guise, but it's nice to have them back with us. Today comes under the auspices, not just of King's, but of the Treasury relationship, which has been really gathering a bit of pace over recent years. I'd like to say also, a really heartfelt thanks to our visiting professors, Lord Macpherson of Twitter, Bill Keegan, who I'm not sure is here yet after lunch, and of course Ed Balls. I'm being serious. Without their goodwill, these things would not be garnering the sort of attention that they are. Through teaching, research, and today through this quite remarkable event. It's 20 years to the day, as we know, that New Labour stormed into Downing Street, and we are very nearly, we think, we've been trying to pin it down, that it was 4:15, 20 years ago today, that the letter was passed across that got the operational independence of the Bank of England underway, and what a panel for this first session. We've got Ed Balls, who was Economic Advisor to the Treasury. We've got Lord Burns, who was Permanent Secretary to the Treasury. We've got Dame Kate Barker, who was Chief Economic Advisor to the CBI, but became an external member of the Monetary Policy Committee from 2001. And we've got the current Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, Tom Scholar, who was a policy advisor working on banking supervision, and the official who actually helped draft the letter. So, without further ado, I'd like to pass over to Ed Balls and ask him the question, why was the Bank of England made independent?
Thank you, John. And I'll use the podium if that's okay. We're going to be talking in the second half of the afternoon about the Bank of England today. So this first half is very much about bank independence 20 years ago and how it operated. And having gone back to Harvard after 28 years, a year ago, to be a fellow there, and realising that all of the professors that I'd known then were still there. The students looked the same, the restaurants were all the same, and the only thing which had changed was that I was 28 years older. I would like to say that as far as I'm concerned, this is not a midlife crisis because Tom and Terry look just the same as they did 20 years ago, and so as far as I'm concerned, it's nothing's changed too much. As John said, we think that the letter was handed over by Gordon Brown to Terry as Permanent Secretary at about 4:15 on this afternoon. The 2nd of May. It was obviously actually the Friday, the day after the general election. The timetable was that 2 years before, in 1995, Gordon Brown had floated the idea of Labour at some point considering Bank of England independence, although at the time it was very much depending upon the track record of reforms which were to be put in place after the election. So it was like a medium-term prospect. It was the Monday before the general election. So in these terms, just before the weekend in today's dates, when he said to me, draft a letter to give to the governor because I think we should move immediately and make the Bank of England independent with immediate effect the day after the general election. We drafted the letter, but as we've just said, it wasn't handed to Terry until Gordon arrived as Chancellor on the Friday afternoon, the 2nd of May. Immediately, Terry went out to have some meetings with senior officials and then brought in a very young official at the time who was to work overnight on the papers on how this could be done and to critique our draft letter, whose name was Tom Scholar, who is now the permanent secretary, but at the time was the guy whose hand held the pen, which is always the most powerful thing. The next day on the Saturday, we went up, Gordon Brown and myself, to see Tony Blair up in Islington for the only collective discussion which happened about this decision before it was announced the following Tuesday, during which a Treasury Private Secretary, Moira Wallace, who was currently working for the Prime Minister, when Gordon said we're going to make the Bank of England independent next week, I think he'd actually told Tony Blair the plan on election day. So it wasn't a surprise to Tony Blair. It was quite a big surprise to Moira Wallace, who said, Prime Minister, don't you think we should commission a series of papers to consider the implications and make sure the details are right? To which Tony said, I think it's fine. Gordon thinks it's fine. We'll just do it. And that was collective discussion at that time. Eddie George came in to see Gordon in the Treasury on the Sunday to be given the letters. And then we brought forward the what was the timetabled monthly meeting between the Chancellor and the Governor from the Wednesday to the Tuesday morning. There was a bank holiday on the Monday, and we wanted to move really as markets were opening. We were making the Bank of England independent, but in a kind of unusual way compared to the Federal Reserve, the ECB, the New Zealand models, which were the main ones discussed at the time. The ECB in theoretical form via the Maastricht Treaty. The decision was that the Chancellor would set the inflation target, and we didn't say so in the letter, but the plan was for it to be a symmetric inflation target. There would be 2 deputy governors, one for financial stability as well as one for monetary policy. The Chancellor would appoint 4 of the 9 members of the decision-making monetary policy committee. There would be monthly minutes, including the votes of individuals published with a 2-week lag. And then we introduced, really at the instigation of Alan Budd, the then Chief Economic Advisor, a couple of weeks later, the open letter. The open letter wasn't in the original letter. The idea that if inflation deviated from target by more than 1%, the Governor would then write a letter to the Chancellor explaining why that had happened, how quickly it would return, and why the bank's strategy was consistent with its duty to support the government's wider objectives for growth and employment while maintaining the primacy of the inflation target. So that was the sort of British model. This will all be familiar to all of you. What I want to do is open the discussion today by talking about 4 sub-topics. First of all, why did we do it? Secondly, why did we do it then? Thirdly, what are some of the reasons speculated about which weren't actually reasons why we did it? And finally, what were some of the implications of the decision which at the time we didn't foresee? What was unexpected in the way things transpired? And I'll move briskly through this because we want to get on to hear the others and get on to the discussion. First of all, why did we do it? I think that one is actually the easiest one to answer. First and foremost, an incoming Labour government, out of power for 18 years, needed a credible nominal anchor for the economy. The one thing I was absolutely clear about, having been at the Financial Times in the early 1990s, was we didn't want another exchange rate anchor, as had derailed Labour governments in the late 1920s, the 1940s, the 1960s, and then John Major's government in the early 1990s. And the reforms were very much in the spirit of and continuing the Lamont reforms from 1993, which Terry had overseen, the introduction of the monthly meeting between the Governor and the Chancellor, but in particular the introduction of an inflation target. Secondly, in Gordon's mind, we wanted to move quickly. We'd talked about this the previous September, speculated about whether we should move fast. He hadn't then really talked about it at all in the 6 months before the election. It came as a surprise to me on the Monday when he said, I think if we're going to do this, we should do it straight away. I don't think I was expecting that. I think he knew that the impact of a decision of that magnitude in an unexpected way would define his early period, certainly at the Treasury, and kind of in terms of a boost to credibility, not just measured by economic credibility, long-term interest rates, or the index-linked implied inflation expectation, which jumped down straight away, but more widely, the political credibility. I think also, though, he was absolutely clear he didn't want to have a monthly meeting with Eddie George in which Eddie gave him advice on interest rates and then Gordon made the decision. We were very conscious of the history of past tensions between governors of the Bank of England and Labour chancellors from the 20s and 30s, but also Lord Cromer in the 1960s. We'd seen the Ken and Eddie show operating in the 3 years before the general election, which had been quite combustible at times. But I think at the time, a Conservative Chancellor could deal with that. I think we were very concerned that it would be very difficult for a Labour Chancellor to be in that position. And therefore, if you're going to do it, to make the Bank of England independent, you should move straight away so that it couldn't be seen to be a decision you made because you weren't enjoying the publicity around the monthly meeting between the Governor and the Chancellor. So avoiding that was definitely a reason to move quickly as well. I think also, in that period up to 97, there had been moments of tension between Number 10 and the Treasury under the Conservatives. Clearly, Nigel Lawson had left the Chancellorship in a cloud of great tension between Number 10 and the Treasury at the end of the 1980s. And this may make you smile in retrospect, but at the time, for Gordon Brown, avoiding unnecessary tensions between Number 10 was part of his objective set, and therefore that was also a reason to move quickly. And I think the final thing, one of the things which we also did on that first day, I think actually Terry and I discussed this in detail over the previous months, was we certainly saw the Treasury's objectives widening. We wanted the Treasury to be involved in policies around growth, promoting employment, the windfall tax, the New Deal, poverty reduction, the minimum wage, reform of the welfare state. And I think our sense was that the process of interest rate setting for Chancellors of the Exchequer absorbed an enormous amount of time which arguably could be spent doing other things. And so creating not just credibility, but the time, the policy space to do different things from the Treasury rather than being sucked into a monthly monetary policy process was also a fifth reason for acting. Why did we do it in the way we did it? I think that we wanted clarity in terms of objective. We didn't like the inflation target being 2.5% or less because we wanted to be clear that an independent Bank of England was aiming for a symmetric target, and that inflation which went too low was as problematic as inflation which went too high. That was one of the things which we debated in the weeks after, because I think Eddie in particular was concerned that removing the or less might be seen as a weakening of the anti-inflation commitment of the government. We figured we'd made the Bank of England independent, and we wanted the objective to be clear. And then more generally, there was a desire, and bringing in the external members was very important to this, to challenge the orthodoxy, to bring in people who would have opinions which they would express in the meetings, but also outside of the meetings, and would absolutely not follow a lead. We didn't want to have the lack of clarity which you saw at the Fed at the time, which we've seen subsequently in spades at the European Central Bank, where nobody quite knows who thinks what. And being clear about the target, but also be clear about the attribution of votes, and bringing in external members was, in our view, very important to that. I remember sitting with Nick Macpherson in the Chancellor's outer office, ringing Larry Summers to get his advice and saying that we were about to appoint an American citizen, Deanne Julius, but also a Dutch, I think at the time, Dutch-American citizen, Willem Buiter to the Monetary Policy Committee, and Larry almost choking on the phone at the idea that we were bringing in Willem Buiter on the grounds that he thought he would be rather opinionated. And he said to me, do you really think that Eddie, George and Mervyn are going to find that comfortable? And my answer was, well, that's part of the reason why we're doing it, because we want that, that sense of debate and, you know, it would be wrong to say friction, but certainly challenge. I think we'd seen the way in which, in the previous Parliament, the Council of Economic Advisers, the wise men, had, although it was intended by the previous chancellors to kind of lead to a broader debate about policy, I think in reality it tended to confuse. That was my reading. And we felt that external members, plus the clarity of the target, would lead to a wider and more informed debate about policy. And there was also a fourth sub-objective, which was more, I think, me rather than anybody else. I'd come out of Harvard. I'd seen the way in which people move between academia and the Council of Economic Advisers in the White House. The fact there were many academics who taught me who had spent periods working either at the Fed or in the White House. And our observation was that that was something which happened a great deal less in the UK. In some ways, Terry and Alan Budd were exceptions to that rule, although it had been kind of one way with Terry. He'd come in and hadn't gone back. And the idea of having 4 external members for 3-year terms, the idea that would encourage a group of people participating in the policy debate, the academic debate, who over time would become ex-members of the Monetary Policy Committee, was something which was part of our objective set at that time. 3 reasons why I think we weren't making the Bank of England independent. One was that the Bank of England independence would be an alternative to joining the single currency. I don't think that was part of our thinking, or at least part of Gordon Brown and Tony Blair's thinking at all. I mean, it was certainly part of my thinking, and I'd written a pamphlet a few years before advocating bank independence, but as part of that saying that I didn't think joining the single currency was a good idea. But I don't think Tony Blair and Gordon Brown saw bank independence as being an alternative to the euro at that time. I think that became the case over time, but it wasn't in their minds in 1997. On the other hand, when I talked to Terry subsequently about the decision, I think the preparations in the Bank of England and the Treasury had assumed that we would go for a much more Maastricht compliant approach to central bank independence as a signal of our potential joining the single currency intentions. And I think from our point of view, the fact that the way we were legislating for central bank independence was not Maastricht compliant was buying us space. It was certainly meaning that we would have to take another act if we wanted to join the single currency and change again the Bank of England constitution. So while it wasn't a reason for not joining the euro, there's no doubt that going for a more British model in our minds was buying space and it kind of easing the pressure about whether we would be joining in the first wave in 1999. Second reason why I don't think, which I don't think was important in the decision, was financial regulation. The decision which we had made in the months before was that we wanted to move to unified statutory regulation. At the time, we had regulation by the banking industry, but also, I think, 6 different other non-statutory bodies doing different aspects of self, if you like, financial regulation. And our desire was to move to unified statutory regulation. And that's what we saw the Financial Services and Markets Bill as being fundamentally about. I think it's also the case, though, that there had been 2 or 3 events which had been a hit to the credibility of the Bank of England in banking regulation, Johnson Matthey, BCCI and Barings. I don't think they were decisive, though. I think more importantly, we were also making the Bank of England independent, and that in and of itself was a very big task. And for the same institution and leadership, both to be making the Bank of England independent and establishing a new independent statutory regulator, that seemed to be a very big task indeed. And therefore, the idea that you would, as it happened, move Howard Davis to be the new head of the FSA sort of felt like a good outcome, even if it was a bit controversial at the time. There was a division, though, within the government of the Bank of England. There were some who thought there should be a very clean split. So Steve Robson at the Treasury, Mervyn King at the Bank of England really wanted there to be a much greater divide between Bank of England independence as a monetary policy maker and the new Financial Services Authority as the financial regulator. The alternative view, which was certainly an Eddie George view, certainly my view, and Gordon's view as well, was that we didn't want to remove the Bank of England from the financial stability field, and that therefore we would set up 2 deputy governors, one for monetary policy, which was Mervyn, and the second one, which started off being Howard Davis, but then became David Clementi for financial regulation. And the idea was that the Bank of England should be the systemic overseer of the system with that deputy governor. As I said, it was controversial at the time because some thought this was the wrong thing to do. But I don't think breaking financial regulation from the bank was a primary motivator of the decision. And as for the debt management issue, which was actually in the days after, as Terry may say, the most controversial aspect of this was really not something which was in our minds at all. In fact, I spoke to a senior person at the Treasury a couple of days before the general election, who I shouldn't name because I don't want to break any confidences, but I called Gus and at the Treasury, and he said the one thing you should definitely do, if this is what you're thinking of, is establish an independent debt management agency. And that went into the letter, as I said, a couple of days before. I think from a Treasury point of view, this was very welcome. It turned out to be very unwelcome indeed at the Bank of England, and especially for the Bank of England official who was in charge of debt management. But as I said, this was absolutely not part of our thinking at all. It came into the process very late indeed. Finally, I said I'd talk about implications which we didn't foresee at the time. And I think I'm going to mention 4. First of all, monetary policy making became much more flexible, fast-moving, reactive to new information than any of us expected. The Bank of England, in the autumn of 97 into 98, when inflation was rising, raised interest rates month after month after month. And then in the autumn of 1998, when you had the first tech shock, cut interest rates month after month after month, much more quickly than any of us expected. I think Willem Boyte was partly responsible for that because he strongly had the view that if the information changed, you should change your mind. So in that sense, he was called a hawk in the first few months because he wanted rates to go up, and then he was called a dove because he wanted rates to go down. But in the end, he was just a good Keynesian who thought you should respond to new information by acting. But that became very much part of the philosophy of the bank. And I think I learned in that period, which I didn't expect, which was that the truth is politicians find it very hard to make interest rate decisions, to cut or to increase. And in particular, they always want to wait for more information in order to make sure that they are as secure as they can be, that they're making the right decision and won't have to change their minds 1 or 2 months later. The culture developed in this new Bank of England that actually it was okay to change their minds. And so you ended up with a much more responsive, fine-tuning monetary policy under an independent Bank of England that I think we've seen in the past, or you would have seen under a Labour Chancellor. The second thing, which I don't think we fully anticipated, was how much the decision would strengthen the hand of the Treasury vis-à-vis Number 10 and other spending departments. I remember one discussion about the level of the youth minimum wage, where Tony Blair advocated a higher level and then asked Gordon what he thought. Gordon turned to me and I said, well, of course it would be a good idea, but I don't think we can necessarily second-guess the decision of the Bank of England, and they might decide as an independent institution in these circumstances to raise interest rates, and that was enough to persuade Tony Blair that it wasn't something he ever wanted to do in the first place. And I think more generally, in fiscal discussions we had in that first period, the Treasury's ability to enforce fiscal discipline was enhanced by the fact that we'd given away power to the Bank of England because there was a credible threat that they would act, and it wasn't something of which we had direct or indirect control. The only cabinet minister who ever really pressed against that was David Blunkett, who was Education and Employment Secretary, and a couple of times went down to have meetings with the Bank of England to make his case for more action, if you like, on interest rates to support the economy and unemployment. But the reality was that by the time you got to within, say, 2 years into bank independence, this had become pretty consensual. I remember Eddie George going to the TUC, I think in the autumn of 1998, but it could have been 99, and actually getting a very good reception in what we all thought would be rather difficult circumstances. The third thing, which sort of happened much later, I think we worried that fiscal coordination would be a challenge. The reality was that we were always very clear, as a Treasury, we weren't going to comment on the Bank of England, but the Bank of England would comment on Treasury decisions insofar as they affected its ability to meet its inflation target. And there's no doubt that as a discipline on fiscal decision-making, an independent Bank of England being able to speak publicly undoubtedly meant that we had to think about fiscal monetary policy coordination in an acute way. And then what we didn't foresee was after the financial crisis, when you have a zero lower bound on interest rates, in those circumstances, the Bank of England is much less able to influence fiscal decision-making by the Treasury, which is like an unresolved issue. And then finally, obviously, what we saw in the 2000s was, in the end, the emergence of financial stability issues in the financial crisis. The reality was that there was a monthly meeting of the Treasury, the FSA, and the Bank of England every month for 10 years before the financial crisis, in which they discussed at length the Millennium Bug, and also at length whether ABN AMRO, if it merged with Barclays, ought to be regulated in London or Amsterdam. But I'm afraid none of the institutions individually and collectively were seeing the problem emerging, and that was clearly a problem which was unforeseen by all of us. So in the end, in conclusion, this was actually quite a contentious issue at the time. People forget that the then Shadow Chancellor of the Exchequer, Ken Clarke, declared against bank independence, and the Conservative Party voted against the legislation in the summer of 1998. But actually, by the time you got to the next general election, it had moved from being contentious to being consensual. And I think the interesting thing with us discussing bank independence 20 years on is even after a financial crisis, which was quite destabilizing and led to lots of debates about structures and policies and lots of reforms, which we'll discuss in the second half today, actually, in this country, the consensus about operational independence for the Bank of England to set interest rates to meet an inflation target has held and remains, I believe, and I hope will continue to be the case, part of a cross-party consensus in our country. So, some introductory remarks for me. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Over to you, Lord Burns.
Do you want me to get that?
Entirely up to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Ed, for that history story, really. I'll talk a little bit about in a sense, the lead up to it from the Treasury perspective. The first question, of course, is why didn't it happen earlier? And of course, as is well known, it was looked at quite seriously on two previous occasions, once by Nigel Lawson in 1988 and again by Norman Lamont after Black Wednesday. In both cases, prime ministers were very much against the proposal. In both cases, it followed a period when monetary policy had been difficult, and in both cases, it followed a period where the chancellors were fed up with interference from number 10 and were looking for ways of getting around that. Treasury officials were not entirely agreed on it during that period, but there was, I think, very much a feeling on behalf of prime ministers that they were not really prepared to look at this from a position of weakness. They weren't prepared. I think Alan Budd once put it. They were not going to accept think that the Bank of England would be asked to do a job where the politicians had failed. And I think that encapsulates pretty well what the mood of the time was on both of those occasions. However, I think it is at the same time the case that the events following Black Wednesday in 1992 and the changes that were made at that point very much formed the basis for what was subsequently happened, and in a sense enabled the system to have adapted quite a long way towards it. Whereas I think on the two previous occasions when it had been looked at, it would have really been a very unexpected, very sharp, and I think potentially quite disruptive process. Of course, after the departure from the ERM and Norman Lawn put in place the new framework, which was of targeting inflation, not because this was some brilliant innovation or a new idea, something that was being heard of for the first time, because by then it was really the last game in town that was standing after having looked at a whole variety of other policies in the meantime. Until 1992, too, I think it is worth stressing, there was a round of official meetings on a monthly basis which provided a report to the Chancellor and the Governor. Meetings between the Chancellor and the Governor only took place when they thought it was necessary, when there was some event, when there'd been some change where they felt that maybe interest rate moves were necessary. What happened after 1992 with the Lamont reforms were that there would be a predetermined timetable, there would be a fixed monthly meeting with the Governor. The Bank of England, extraordinarily enough, would be allowed to publish its own independent inflation report. Up to that point, anything which the Bank of England published in the Bank of England Quarterly Bulletin would come to the Treasury for approval, and officials like Tom at that stage would go through it in great detail to make sure that there were no words in it that might be felt to imply that the bank wasn't fully supportive of what it was that the government was trying to do. But it was felt that as part of the openness transparency regime that that the Bank of England would be able to put its own report out, independent of the Treasury. Then, during the Ken Clarke period as Chancellor, the next step was, of course, to publish the minutes of the meeting and what came to be then known as the Ken and Eddie show. That itself was, I think, another very important step. It showed the balance of voting between, in the sense of views of the bank and the Treasury. I think it also demonstrated the complexity of a lot of the decisions that are involved in monetary policy. It helped the scrutiny process, and of course it avoided each of the parties rewriting history after the event, which on some previous occasions had tended to happen. I think the other question, which I just briefly mentioned too, was why did it take so long to have an inflation target? This had been looked at many times in the Treasury before 1992. And to say it was only really introduced then because the other methods of control had proved to be too difficult to implement. And fundamental concern was that, of course, the well-known lags between changes in interest rates and changes in inflation at a time when inflation and interest rates were both high was always feared that it would produce quite destabilizing effects, because with the long lags you were trying to shoot at a target that was some way off in terms of what might otherwise have happened, and that volatility had always been a great worry about inflation targets. But as the inflation rate came down post-92, and particularly, of course, by the time we got to 1997, inflation was indeed low, and those problems about instability and worries had somewhat faded. There were still quite a lot of operational problems which had already begun to appear during the post-92 period about the measurement of the output gap, which had become quite an important part of the analysis, the issues about world inflation, about how much attention to pay to the exchange rate, and whether there should be any role or what the role should be for asset prices in that whole analysis, because not only the exchange rate but also house prices had also often been quite an important issue that had been looked at. But the process had worked pretty well. I think by the time we got to 95, 96, although there were differences between Eddie and Ken Clark, by and large there weren't huge differences. And I think the fact that this was played out in full public view had strengthened the belief in the inflation target, that it would be possible to meet it. And of course we had this very good world inflation background where world inflation had been coming down. I'm often asked the question, how surprised was I by this decision to have statutory independence? The answer is obviously to some degree. I mean, my timetable, and in fact, I was just trying to recall it, Ed, as you were going through there. I think we're just slightly later in the day than you implied. I think Gordon arrived at about 4:30, and we had the meeting 5 o'clock. It's 6:30. Tom, I had the meeting with all of the Treasury officials who were involved in this work, including Tom, who was sent away to work on it overnight with the draft letter. Gordon, if you remember, had arrived in the Treasury to this sort of great acclaim, much photographed, much televised, because there were some cameras that were following him for much of the time at that stage. We went upstairs, and I introduced him to his staff, and I think there was just the three of us, went into his office, Ed and Gordon and myself, and Gordon handed me the draft letter, and that was written for Eddie, and said we wanted to get this out over the weekend. In the quite a lot of the, it wasn't a huge, I mean, so it was a surprise undoubtedly that it was going to be happening quite so quickly. It wasn't a huge surprise that in a sense we were on track, I think, to have statutory independence. As I say, the groundwork had been laid. During the run-up to the election, as Ed has mentioned, he and I met, I mean, dozens of times, and telephone calls. I mean, hours and hours were spent on the whole list of Treasury issues. And of course, this issue was one that we kept coming back to. Gordon had already made published the idea of having a monetary policy committee, and there were various discussions between Ed and Gordon and the bank, and between the Treasury people and the bank as to how to make this work with a new government, and particularly if there was going to be a monetary policy committee in the bank, even if without statutory independence. And I think it did become quite clear as we went through that we were flogging a dead horse, really, that it was very difficult to find a way of turning what had been the Ken and Eddie show, which had probably ran its course and was very much ad hominem. I mean, it was an arrangement that could be made to work between the two of them, and it was never terribly clear that it was going to be able to move on to a different chancellor. And we had, of course, also been thinking quite a lot about what kind of bank would be necessary to make us Maastricht compliant or compliant with the ECB, and a great deal of even legal work had been done on that, almost some of it from the point of view what was the minimum that we could get. But we were ourselves, in terms of both thinking and in terms of a lot, therefore, of the detailed background, we were in quite a good position, I think, for when we received the letter. I think Tom ended up having he'll tell you himself, 2 sleepless nights, more or less, as he had to get all of this ready, and we went through it the following day. And in a number of ways, there were drafting changes, but the essence of it remained, and Ed has described the whole process over the weekend, and we were ready for publication of it all by the end of the weekend. I think undoubtedly, certainly in the early stages, the whole thing worked very well, and I think the whole notion of operational independence, with the accountability still being for the target being left to the government, worked extremely well. I would also agree with the point that the MPC were much more flexible than politicians would be in those circumstances. And indeed, on the run-up to the election, there'd been a whole series of these monthly meetings between the bank and the Treasury where there had been, Eddie had been pressing for a move in interest rates, and Ken Clark kept resisting it, saying, well, are you sure? I'm not quite certain that things have changed, and the whole thing of balancing the various factors had delayed it. I think the whole notion of operational independence also we managed to get over quite well, which helped with a good deal of the presentation. I think that issue itself, Mark, you did over time become somewhat clouded. I think the degree of understanding of and the distinction between operational independence and complete independence had become clouded as you moved through it. And I was very struck. In fact, you can still see it in quite a lot of the writings of people who somehow or other think that the Bank of England had been given complete independence. And it surfaced again, of course, later on where and we certainly saw it in 2007-8, at the beginning of the financial crash, the whole question of just how far did the Bank of England's independence stretch? Did it really stretch whereby they could make decisions about Northern Rock and about Bradford and Bingley and other banks or not? But I think from the outset, the fact that this was operational independence, I think, was a great success. The later period, I think, does not tell quite such a happy story about either inflation targeting or about in a sense, the way in which this particular part of monetary policy is set up. As Ed has mentioned, of course, the whole thing and the whole framework that was being used in terms of monetary policy did not really give any warning of what was happening in 2007, 2008. Many of the monetary indicators which would have given more warning had by then been relegated to a very substantial emphasis upon the output gap. I think during that period too, there was some, I would say, and I was on the outside, of course, quite a lot of doubt about just who was pulling the strings here, whether it was the Treasury or it was the Bank of England when it came to some of those issues of what we now call macroprudential policy. The other part of this, of course, which Ed has mentioned, which I think I should refer to, is that part of the letter all went very smoothly. And I don't go into too much detail of it today, but what didn't go at all smoothly was the whole question of moving banking supervision from the Bank of England, which was also combined, of course, with the issues of the Debt Management Office. And because we'd had quite a lot of debate about what should be said to the Bank of England on the day that this was all announced, and there was a side letter which said to the bank that it would be looked at, the whole question of moving banking supervision, but the bank would have an opportunity to be fully consulted in it. Then there was the announcement quite soon afterwards, of course, that the FSA would be set up and that this would be removed. This caused the most desperate problem for Eddie George, who really regarded that he had been very badly let down, that he was being seen as overseeing the whole dismantling of the Bank of England, and that the Treasury were really gunning for the bank and wanted to dismember it. And it was a very rough 2 months. At the heart of it also was an issue which came back to haunt us, of course, later, or to haunt, I was no longer there, but to haunt people, which was the whole question of lender of last resort, because one of the issues that very much came under attention when we were trying to set up the FSA and the framework about what was the Bank of England's responsibility and what was the FSA's responsibility was this whole question of lender of last resort. Some in the Treasury, some of my colleagues, thought this should go to the FSA. Of course, the bank were very resistant to that idea. Ed then came up with the idea of the MOU and the tripartite arrangements. I have to say, and again, looking at it from a distance, I don't think that what happened in 2007 shows that that really worked when it really mattered. And the whole question of lender of last resort, what the role was of the Bank of England, what their responsibilities were, what the responsibilities were of the FSA, and what the responsibilities of the Treasury were, all became very cloudy. Now, later on, we'll get on to, and I don't want to trespass onto that, the whole area of, in a sense, where we go from here, but I think I am left with the thought that trying to divide the whole thing between monetary policy and between what we now call macroprudential policy is a very difficult thing to do. We talked earlier about how the inflation interest rates became very flexible once the MPC was set up. It's been the opposite of that over the last 9 years, where there has scarcely been a move. Can one really say that we have a regime of inflation targeting? I mean, are interest rates really responding to the inflation rate relative to its target? Or is it actually looking at a much wider range of things and what is happening to the economy more widely and what is happening to the whole issue of financial stability? And I'm left wondering whether this division and this allocation of responsibilities between them is really something that has shown to come well out of it. But there's no doubt that it was, to my mind, the most important occasion. To me, it was the culmination of a journey we'd been on for a number of years. I think it was an enormously brave move. It was very well prepared. Ed deserves an enormous amount of credit for the preparation that went into it and the diligence that he had shown in involving a lot of us as he was developing his own thinking and making sure that we were ready, that we were in a position where we could take this on. And without a doubt, it landed in a very successful way, and for quite a lot of years, on what was, acceptably, a very benign world economic background, it worked astonishingly well. I think the lessons about the post-2008 I will leave for other people. Thank you very much.
Dame Kate.
Thank you very much. I think my first reflection today is that following a period in which the UK kept changing its mind about what it wanted to do with monetary policy, the fact that this regime has survived more or less for 20 years is a considerable tribute to the way in which it was set up, and we've heard a lot from both Terry and Ed about and of course Tom, about their role in setting it up. I, of course, had previously, not only am I an ex-member of the Monetary Policy Committee, as Ed remarked, on this happy band he was hoping to set up, but I'm also an ex-wise man. So I do have the ability to look back and sort of think about the differences between the two. It's an enormous privilege for me, by the way, to be a member of the committee for 9 years, and it's an opportunity for which I have to thank Ed, who appointed me. In those happy, well, I'm never sure about that. In those happy and far off days, of course, you didn't have to sit through interviews. Nowadays, I interview people to join the MPC, and my main reflection on that is I don't think I would have survived the process. But in those days, I was simply summoned by Ed and Gus and went in and met them, and they said, would I like to join the MPC? And I said, yes, and it was announced the next day, and I had to ring my husband up, who was away on a course, and say, you may read about me in the newspaper, and he was a bit surprised to discover that so much had happened while he was just away for a couple of days. The other thing I remember about it was that because it was all done very quickly, Eddie George was naturally a bit anxious about whether people were, as it were, up to it. And I went in to see him, and he said, are you sure you're happy about this? Because you've always seemed to rather enjoy being at the CBI. And I was anxious to reassure him that I was happy about it. So I said, no, it's absolutely fine. I was so pleased when they told me that I almost kissed Ed Balls. And Eddie, bless him, didn't miss a beat. He said, well, surely you'd have wanted to kiss Gus as well. And but anyway, so I didn't. I hasten to say I didn't kiss either of them. But anyway, I am now the only person speaking today. Tom and indeed Nick have had the misfortune to sit in on many MPC meetings. I always feel that this must be very difficult for the Treasury representative because they don't get to say very much, and they must be yearning to put us right. Perhaps they'd like to say something about the experience of sitting in. But I'm going to say something about the strength of the institutional setting, a little bit about the nature of independence as experienced by an external member, and something about the role of small p politics, although I may push a little bit into the area of the next session. If I do, I apologise for that. I think the main thing I would say is that when we were sitting there operating the legislation that was set up, it actually was extremely thoughtful and robust. We've heard described how quickly the initial thinking was and how the letter had to be drafted overnight. But the truth is, the legislation that came in worked very well as a member living with it. It didn't really have a great deal wrong with it. And in particular, I thought the symmetry of the target, the fact that you worried about inflation being too low, was extremely useful. And coupled to that, of course, was the second clause in the Act, the sort of subordinate clause about having to pay attention to the government's policy with regard to growth and inflation. It's worth remembering that that was put in despite the fact that that was a time when the whole period has been about a battle to get inflation to a tolerably low level. I don't think at that time anybody would have considered that we would go through a period such as that we've been living in roughly since the financial crisis, in which by and large, if there's one thing that people have wanted to do in the UK, it's to try and move the rate of wage increases upwards, because a bit of wage inflation might be quite handy with the debt levels that we live with, and that's proved harder to do than perhaps one thought. I thought that second clause was important because it, of course, carried the implication that you didn't have to rush inflation back to target from a shock, and that was incredibly useful in the early days. A lot of discussion about how people think today that the independence is all absolutely fine, but actually in the early years there was a lot of questioning of independence, and I was sent out because I was thought to be good at talking to business groups. I was frequently sent out to reassure them that we weren't, as the people used to say, some of us were inflation nutters and hard line, and I found reference to that second clause very useful. But not everybody thought this. I was once rather taken aback in an MPC meeting when one very senior member of the bank, I shall remain nameless, said that they never paid any heed to the second clause at all, although I would have thought its purpose was quite clear. It was to guard against an overreaction to external shocks. And if I have one criticism of the framework as it was set up, not just the monetary framework, but also the general economic framework as it came into play in 1997, it's that if you go back and look at the sort of account of the framework that Ed and Gus O'Donnell wrote a few years later, it doesn't talk very much about the international economy. And of course, the international economy is often what comes along and sets you off track. Some of the strengths, however, didn't come from the Act. They also came from how the bank chose to operate it. And it sounds rather sad to say I enjoyed it, given that I sat through 108 meetings of it. But I used to enjoy the discipline of the monthly Thursday meetings when we all sat around and rather solemnly gave our views in turn. And I'm not suggesting that without having to state your individual view over a period of no more than 8 or 10 minutes, any of us wouldn't have done considerable amounts of work. But the discipline of having to produce a set of well-argued remarks that would stand up to scrutiny from your fellow members did focus the mind, and often it was in producing those remarks I found I actually made my decision about how to vote, i.e. I'd sit down to write them with some ideas about what I was going to do, and as I kind of forced myself up against the data, I would sometimes find I changed my mind. I wonder how that meeting is now, because of course, since the decision to publish the transcripts, I think some of the more kind of things we used to float in those meetings will get missed out. And I also worry that one of the strengths of the Thursday morning was there was some ability to challenge each other's views. And I imagine that that may not happen quite so much. Now everything is going to be published in due course, and I'll be interested to see whether transparency, in fact, has brought a loss of debate when in due course we do get the transcripts, though I suspect by then I may be too old to care. But it was very useful to have, I want to say a little bit about independence. So I thought the independence of the members, as Ed Walls has already said, was really important. The fact that our votes were recorded and we were very free to speak out to justify our own views. And that brings pluses and minuses. I think the pluses win out, but there are minuses. Pluses, of course, include the fact it gave us a very strong and proper sense of responsibility when decisions were difficult, and it gave the MPC ability to air a range of views in public fora without there being some difficulty about it. And it gave a lot of support to the position of the external members who, of course, owed no particular loyalty to the bank hierarchy. To some extent, that was the point about having external members. I'm less sure about the point that's been made about flexibility, a fact that the bank was ready to do something and then move the other way. I just have to say I perceived quite a lot of reluctance when I was there to take a decision when you might want to move the other way. But there are some downsides to all this transparency. One was that, particularly if you'd been on the committee for some time, there's a terrible temptation to cast a minority vote, because otherwise external people tend to ask what the heck you're doing there. And I thought it was incredibly important not to yield to this temptation. The only proper vote is a vote that you think everybody should make, rather as in perhaps in an election. I felt a more acute form of the temptation to cast minority votes was what some of us on the committee used to think of as grandstanding, when people on the MPC used that membership to give weight to their personal views on topics unrelated to monetary policy, or indeed playing up in a fairly aggressive way differences of views they had either with the minority or the majority on the committee. And neither of those things, I think, is particularly helpful to fostering what, on the whole, was a reasoned and thoughtful debate, which the MPC was at its best. But I was led to reflect a bit further on the grandstanding tendency recently by a Vox EU note by Richard Barwell, who was formerly a bank staff member, who commented that, in fact, it was pretty rare for any member to cast a vote more than 25 basis points away from the majority position. And he pointed out very reasonably that, according to the bank's model, this implied that the difference of view was never at any time more than 10 basis points at the 2-year horizon on the inflation target. Now, of course, it's possible that one reason that people showed this reluctance to cast widely different votes was that although, in fact, their views were further apart, they didn't want to kind of expose big difference of opinion to the public debate. But I don't think that can really be true. I think the alternative view seems to me more likely to be true, which is actually there was a terrible tendency, however much we resisted it, towards a bit of groupthink. There were somehow views on the committee that it was not quite respectable to hold. And in support of this, one of the things I noted during my excessively long time on the committee was that in their first meeting, new members often sort of said, why is the level of rates what it is? How on earth did you get here? But they never ever asked that again. It only a question they only ever asked in their first meeting. After that, they only ever talked in terms of changes, and I think that is something worth reflecting on. Just as an aside for those of you who ever look at ex-MPC members debating on Twitter, I tweeted rather in support of the arguments in the Richard Barwell piece. And this was very strongly opposed by both Andrew Sentence and Danny Blanchflower, and I think it must be one of the few occasions in which they formed any agreement. So I'm glad to have performed that small service. To turn to the findings, but let's say a few things about politics. I've got no hesitation in saying that during my time on the MPC, party politics had no effect at all on our monthly decisions. And I can, in fact, only remember one discussion of kind of party politics, and that was actually in my very last meeting as an MPC member, which was a meeting about the drafting of the inflation report in the aftermath of the 2010 election. Of course, we were doing that drafting at a time when actually the new government hadn't been formed, so it was quite a difficult time. And that report contained the sentence, "A more detailed and demanding path of fiscal consolidation than set out in the March 2010 budget," which was, of course, the last Labour government budget, "may therefore be needed in order to avoid unnecessary increases in the cost of issuing public debt." I'm sure in this room there are lots of people who have different views about the rights and wrongs of the economics of that sentence, but I felt it was unnecessarily political in what was a pretty heated political atmosphere at the time, and I still think that that was an error. And in that regard, I'm going to be interested also, perhaps in some future time, to get ex-MPC members talking about their role in the run-up to discussions at the bank about positioning around the EU referendum, which I also think will be an interesting thing. And it's important, I think, when a discussion about operational independence, the key thing to me about operational independence is it's something which is granted to you by politicians. It isn't something that belongs to the MPC by right. And in that sense, there is some kind of small p political backdrop to all the MPC's decisions. So what do I mean by that? Well, and Terry's already touched on this, pre-crisis, we did focus very much in the MPC on this 2-year horizon for inflation. Arguably, that meant we took far too little account of the imbalances building in the economy, which, if we better understood them, and I've written about this elsewhere, might have encouraged a different monetary policy setting, which would have been justified, of course, by commentary on long-term risks. Now, I'm not suggesting that the actions of the MPC shouldn't always be weighed in light of the inflation target. That, of course, is what the Act stipulates. But the post-crisis behaviour has demonstrated that that can be articulated very flexibly indeed. And again, Terry has already referred to that by asking, in fact, has the bank been inflation targeting over the past 6 years? My view is that because we focus too stringently on this 2-year point inflation target, it distracted us to some extent from what I would describe as doing the right thing. And ultimately, it's only if the bank is able to do the right thing, which may or may not be politically unpopular at the time, will it enable the bank to take those unpopular decisions when they're needed. So doing the right thing became sort of uppermost in my mind. One way in which I think this could be dealt with in the context of inflation target might be to move away from a point inflation target to a band, so that where you were aiming for in the band would give some idea of some of the messages you wanted to convey about policy, and perhaps that could be done a bit more simply than occurred when we had all the trappings of forward guidance introduced in the last few years. However, you might argue that there's no need to change anything about the bank, because after all, the bank has rather surprisingly emerged from the crisis with considerably more powers rather than fewer, which in light of our previous performance, you might have thought was what the bank deserved. I have to be blunt. I think it's very remarkable that the bank emerged with more powers, and as others have already hinted, I think some of the issues about coordination between fiscal and monetary policy and between macro-prudential policy and monetary policy and indeed fiscal policy remain unanswered, and I worry that that is what is going to sow the seeds of our next crisis. Thank you.
Tom.
Thank you very much, John. Well, time is marching on, and we need a bit of space for discussion. So I'll just make a couple of really very brief remarks and then look forward to comments and questions from the audience. So sitting down last night trying to answer your question, why was the bank made independent? I've tried to answer that from the perspective of a junior official involved at the time. I should say the famous letter, which has been referred to on several occasions, was very much the work of many hands, starting with Ed, prepared the first draft and closely involved in every successive iteration, but I can see others in the audience too, not least Stephen Pickford, who was there all weekend working away on it, so I'm sure we can swap reminiscences of that over a well-deserved cup of tea in a few moments' time. But the answer why, the question why, the answer I think I can only answer really by talking about the change in the external environment that made it possible, the actual impulse for why to do it. I think Ed has set out very fully. So what made the context permissive to this proposal? Well, first of all, there was always, as Terry has said, a strong academic, technocratic policy-making case for this change. Other nominal anchors had been tried repeatedly and found wanting. Other chancellors had wanted to do this. The move, I think, to inflation targeting from 93 was very much an organic step in this direction, and the move to operational responsibility, logically, the next step. So there were several years, even if people were not talking about doing this, when other things relevant were happening, which made it possible. Secondly, I think the European context was pretty important here, because don't forget there was we may have had an ERM crisis in 92, but the rest of the ERM had its own crisis in 93, which stimulated a much more rapid move towards the creation of the single currency. With that, moves towards a European central bank, which would be independent and which would have an inflation targeting or a price stability, subtle, important distinction there, but a clear remit. And I think over the previous 20 years since the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, we were by no means the only country with a bank that was not independent, but that was changing around us. I think that was relevant. The other thing is, I think the debate over Britain's own possible future membership of the single currency area. And I was interested, Ed, by what you said, because my recollection is very much that when we were considering shortly before, actually on the day of the election, because on the day of the election, Terry called me up to his office in the afternoon and said, I don't know where you picked it up from, Terry, but he said, there's something going on, not quite sure what's going on, something to do with the Bank of England, might be something to do with Maastricht, don't quite know. Can you write a paper on it, please? So with that very clear remit, I went and did exactly what he'd asked me. But at the time, and in the Treasury, we'd done plenty of thinking about what would you have to do to the statutory underpinning of the Bank of England in order to make it Maastricht compliant, which of course is, as Ed said, not what we actually ended up doing, but I think that was an important part of the debate at the time. The third bit of context, and Ed, perhaps you might say something about this in a moment, didn't really ever occur to me at the time, but I wonder subsequently. Given the history of in the 20th century of the Labour Party with central banks, going right back to 1931, the bankers' ramp, there was always a strain of thinking in the Labour Party which was suspicious of or hostile to central banks. Is this a reform that had in the end to come from the left? I'd be interested very much in your answer to that, Ed. Is this something that only a Labour government could have done? And is it something that only a new Prime Minister and Chancellor could do, each for their slightly different reasons? Quite hard, I think, for a government in office for some time. And maybe that was what led the Chancellor of the day to decide to do this straight away. The only other thing I'd like to say is on the question of the durability of the framework. So I remember thinking at the time that this would be an immensely controversial act. I think it proved not to be so. I mean, there was, as Ed said briefly, some opposition, but already by the time of the next election, this had been established as a cross-party consensus. Part of the reason why we ended up with the phrase operational responsibility for setting interest rates was precisely because the Chancellor did not want to talk about bank independence. If you go through all the Q&A at the time, you will not find anywhere, we are making the bank independent. We weren't making the bank independent. We were giving it operational responsibility for setting interest rates. I think partly because of that subtlety, when the announcement was made on the 6th of May in the big the room that's called the Churchill Room in the Treasury overlooking Whitehall, I think at the time quite a few of the people present didn't actually grasp quite what was being said. In fact, I remember one of the journalists asking the Chancellor, so you talk about operational responsibility, but what's your role going to be in this? And Gordon Brown said, no, you don't understand, I don't have any role at all in this. And there were moments in that press conference which in a way I've never seen at any other time in my career, when you could see people's jaws literally dropping as they were understanding what was happening. All of that said, the actions of the bank under the framework, I think, never really became controversial. We did, or the Chancellor did say many times around the turn of the century, the phrase, we will always support the bank in the difficult decisions it must take. That was quite a common phrase. But those decisions, I think, never seemed either at the time or subsequently quite as tough as what the then Chancellors were doing in the late 90s and the early 90s, late 80s and early 90s, raising interest rates to high levels, up to 15% in the teeth of a recession. It may be that there was just a bit of serendipity there, in that the time in which the bank was able to establish its track record was precisely one in which there were frequent movements of interest rates, but not big swings. And to the extent there was a big swing, it was downwards, which of course does have major implications, including distributional implications, but somehow doesn't attract quite the same opposition as movements upwards do. Will we all be here in 2037 talking about 40 years on? I don't know, but certainly it's a decision which and a policy development which I think has been remarkably durable and very much now part of the framework. We'll talk in the next session about some of the more current challenges, but for now I'd like to leave it at that and look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Now, we've got about 10 minutes, then you can ask questions over tea, etc. Name, affiliation, nice and pithy. One down the front right here, just to make it as difficult as possible for the mic bearers. Hold on. There you go. Sure.
Nicholas Gill from SciTech. We've become very conscious of the concept of tail risk post the financial crisis. And this is really particularly addressed today in Kate. You spoke of the MPC voting, but very rarely voting by more than 25 basis points either way, which one must say does suggest a certain level of groupthink. Could there have been some merit, in actually assigning one member of the MPC on education to just make the case intellectually for a big change up or a big change down, so as to try and make sure that the tails are being explored in a more systematic way? Or is there are some other ways in which one could avoid the risk of big clustering and a lot of group thinking, that kind of context?
Thank you. Please.
Okay. Well, actually, I'm now going to disclose something that went on the MPC, which I'm sure I'm not supposed to do. During a rather boring period where we hadn't changed rates for a while, one of us was assigned at each meeting to produce what we called a nightmare. I'm sure I'm not supposed to tell you this. So, but in fact, that was very much the kind of thing that you're suggesting. But for some reason, although actually, when I look back at it, the substance of some of those nightmares actually was not dissimilar to what came about with the financial crisis, we still managed to fail to pick up on it. And it's also true that if you look back at some speeches given by Charlie, particularly in the early 2000s, he did talk about longer-term worries and financial imbalances, but again, it never really came up properly at the committee. And I think somebody earlier referred to the rather remarkable fact, I think it was Ed referred to the remarkable fact that the tripartite group never did either. And I think it's true that we were all part of a collective failure. So we did try, as it were, to widen our thinking, but somehow we weren't then able to compress it back in to the slightly majoritist thinking we'd fallen into. I can only say that I look back at this as a real, I think anybody involved in it would say that there was a failure to realise just what the risks were at that time.
Ed, you wanted somebody over this way?
There's a lady there. There's a gentleman there. I thought it was a lady there.
Ian.
There's a lady there.
Thank you. Ian Beasley, historian. I'd like to go back to the decision and how it was made collectively or not collectively in government. When he heard about the proposal, the then Cabinet Secretary, Ron Rosser, told the Prime Minister that he thought that the decision of this importance should be taken to Cabinet. And he was told no, because there was no agreement that decision. Maybe that was the first sign of central government, maybe it was the first sign of the Prime Minister deferring to Gordon Brown as Chancellor and ceding some part of his power. I just wonder what would have happened if Robert Butler had fought harder for the decision to go to Cabinet, if he had used his connections with the Treasury. After all, he was a Treasury official, he was paying close to Stanley Burns, and if he'd lobbied harder for a Treasury to support collective discussion at Cabinet, as well as the Cabinet Secretary himself.
Well, you say about lobbying harder. I think he asked on 3 occasions, didn't he? Would anyone like to jump on that one, please?
I mean, the reality was Labour just won a massive majority. Tony Blair was intensely engaged in his reshuffle, and he was definitely sitting on a sofa when he said, fine. And I think at that time, you're absolutely right that that was how decisions were made, and and the two of them decided. And actually, my memory of the actual morning, the Tuesday morning, was that there was the monthly meeting, the one and only monthly meeting between Gordon and Eddie George. Gordon then rang on the telephone a series of past chancellors to tell them, and then made the announcement at the press conference. So I think there were more members of preceding cabinets who knew about the decision than current cabinet members. Now there were some who would have been consulted, but there was not. The truth was, it was not a collective decision, and I don't think there would have been a single cabinet minister at the time who would have batted an eyelid at that time. That was just absolutely how it was. And but the reality is, there's all these guys who just become cabinet ministers. They've got all these decisions and papers and boxes, and Tony and Gordon were getting on and sorting out the Bank of England, and that just wasn't part. I mean, the only person who spent his whole life writing letters around Whitehall about other people's policy areas was the minister without portfolio, because that was basically his mission in life at the time. I think one of the kind of great challenges for the Labour government 97 to 98 was that until Peter Mandelson got a proper job, all he did was write letters about everybody else's job. So he was probably the only person who was annoyed.
Now,
Please, Terry, please.
can I just say that, I did have several conversations with Robin Butler over the course of the weekend, and I kept him in touch with what was happening. I don't think, it may not be the right thing, but over long periods of time, certainly when I was involved, there was not really an expectation that major economic issues like this would go to cabinet. It would be, interest rate changes never went to cabinet. Leaving the ERM was not an issue that went to cabinet, nor was joining. It was expected, I would say, that those major issues would really, if the Prime Minister and Chancellor agreed, since they went through on the nod.
Thank you. A last question of this, or maybe two, just there, please.
Chris Johnson, from Financial Times. Can I just ask the panel to read about history? If the bank hadn't been made independent, we would certainly probably stop the 20 years of economic performance pre-97 for those 20 years you actually had. Would it have been better or worse, or how much different would it have been had we not taken this decision?
Well, I have looked. A number of times I've looked at this question, and of course the fact is that UK inflation rate is heavily dominated by the world inflation rate, and when the world inflation rate is low and there are no real shocks that are coming from the outside world, then inflation control is a good deal easier than it is if you are in a much more volatile situation. I would say that given the rather benign background that there was over the 20 years in terms of the world inflation rate, it would have probably been messier. I think of there are times when things may have been decisions would have been slower. I find it hard to persuade myself that the outcome in terms of inflation would have been enormously different, because I just look around the world and see what happens to everybody else's inflation rate, and it more or less tracks what happened to our inflation rate. Output now was much more stable than it has been in other periods, but again, there is a certain amount of world effect, I think, in that as well. There's quite a lot of, if you look at the major countries' performance, it bears some resemblance. But of course, everybody else moved to the same sort of regime.
I think I have a very, very different answer to this question. If the pattern of the last 20 years had been replayed after 1997, I think you can be fairly confident that this would have happened. There would have been a big row over interest rates. There would have been a big problem probably with, between number 10 and number 11. Somebody would have got sacked. There would have been a lack of confidence in the monetary regime. People have said the only solution is to sign up with our European partners. The CBI and the TUC would all have said, as happened in 1925 and then in 1990 up to 92, joining the single currency is the only salvation because Britain just can't manage its own affairs, would have joined the euro. There would then have been a global financial crisis. We would have crashed out in a Greek on steroids kind of way. We wouldn't have even bothered with a referendum and would have left the European Union at least 5 years ago. So I think that is absolutely what would... If you want to replay every previous 20-year period of British history, that's exactly what happens. The thing which is utterly compelling about British history is it's almost always the case in the 3 years before a disaster, everybody agrees on the necessary change. So when you think, joining the ERM or going back to gold, everybody thought it was the right thing to do. Everybody. And I think the euro would have... I think that's probably what would have happened. Can I say a couple more things just in terms of the other... I had 3 other things I just want to say really quickly in terms of the other 3 excellent presentations. First of all, on Terry's, the reality was that the MOU between the bank and the Treasury wasn't up to it. When I became a minister again at the Treasury in 2006, we sort of knew it wasn't up to it. John Cunliffe, who's now Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, said to me, I'm really worried about this MOU. We decided to war game, I've written about this in public, war game a financial crisis in the beginning of 2007, in which, interestingly, the case study the Bank of England chose was a northern building society which got into terrible problems because of its collateral-based lending, which then exposed a major clearing bank to the same crisis. And in the discussions which we then had in the war game standing committee between myself, Callum McCarthy and Mervyn King, over a 3-hour meeting, we absolutely found out that the MOU was not up to scratch. And decided we ought to do some work on this. And then, unfortunately, there was a financial crisis a few months later, which absolutely showed the MOU wasn't up to it. So it wasn't like we didn't know, or even that we weren't trying to prepare for a crisis. It's just that the crisis then occurred in almost a prescient way, which nobody was expecting. It's absolutely staggering when you think of it in retrospect.
Could I just comment on that? I mean, because there was some stage during the after the financial crash that I went back and I was summoned. I think I had to go before one of the select committees, and I went back and I actually looked at the MOU drafting. Yeah. And of course, if you read it carefully, you can see the tortured language that is in there as it was trying to gain agreement out of something where there really was no agreement.
But it was fundamentally between the Treasury and the bank was the problem,
yes.
Not between the bank and the FSA.
No.
If the FSA hadn't existed, if you'd made the Bank of England independent and kept regulation in the bank, forget the FSA, you've had exactly the same issue about whether in the end this was a fiscal function or a monetary function.
But it was a great... I mean, I think it's one of those lessons, you spend time papering over cracks. Usually the problems emerge from papering over cracks rather sooner than it did in this case. But it was one of those things that it took a long time before the event that, in a sense, it was designed for took place. And it had never been road tested.
Two other really quick things. Second thing, on Kate's brilliant remarks, I think actually the inflation target was to meet the inflation target at all times. That was what it was in the remit. And actually what had happened was, in the inflation report after 1992, the bank became very focused on the fan chart and the 2-year horizon. And actually, I think our view was you should worry about the inflation target in a month's time and 5 years' time. It ended up, though, that sort of intellectual frame of the 2-year horizon, the fan chart, which really started pre-97 in the bank, did become a kind of very, very big thing. But I don't think it was ever... But that was not the remit of the government.
I completely agree with that. It's something... when I look back at the things, it's something the bank did to itself. And it was actually part of, and it was part of the, and it then became part of what I've rather rudely described as the groupthink. So it was born out of... It sort of got very hard to break away from.
It was born out of the belief that interest rate changes did not have any effect. That had its main effect on an inflation rate on an 18 to 2 months to 2 year time frame.
That's logical, but it was born out of the fact that that was the only thing that mattered when it was sort of born out of the fact that was the only way you should think about setting interest rates.
And the forecast became hugely important in the process because of the 2-year rise.
Yeah, and it distracted us from the longer term questions.
I agree.
And the final thing was, when I was a young leader writer at the Financial Times, wrote a pamphlet for the Fabian Society advocating Bank of England independence because I thought that was better than the ERM or the euro. And Martin Wolf told me, publish it if you like, I agree with it, but that'll be the end of your career in the Labour Party. They'll never ever agree to this. He basically told me it was a kiss of death in terms of my life. And but if you actually look at the way in which we talked about in 92 to 97, we talked about it not only being about inflation, but more about employment and growth. And we talked about the Court of the Bank of England being reformed to bring in voices from all of the nations and regions and both sides of industry. And there was the language was about trying to not only have an inflation focus, but also this sort of broader and more representative Bank of England. So in a way we were trying to use that, but I think if it hadn't been for the large majority, it wouldn't have happened. And you're totally right, unless you do it immediately, it's almost impossible then to do it subsequently.
Can I just have one
Please, go on.
one final other thing, on, in a sense, in response to Ed on the Chris Giles question, let's call it. I thought my sort of framework is that in times when inflation rates are low, you've got an absence of shocks, then the regime does not bite that much. I mean, and indeed your paper shows that in the last 10 years, the relationship between Bank of England independence and inflation rates disappears. Yep. That it is a phenomenon which is of enormous strength at times of high and volatile inflation and where there is a lot of volatility. I think just happens that it coincides. I mean, and I'm not saying this in any way to resile from the fact of having this operational independence, which I think has worked extremely well. I just believe that it's happened that for that 20 years that we're talking about, the background was one in which it wasn't probably that critical. And
I'd like to say something else to Chris Giles' question. Ed talked about the fact that the decisions of the bank to some extent constrained fiscal policy. I'm going to say something a bit different. To some extent, because there was confidence in the sort of what I'll loosely call the market, that the existence of the bank would prevent too much demand being pumped into the system. Actually, what it led to is what I still think is one of the unresolved problems, was an imbalance between fiscal and monetary policy, because the government was able to have perhaps a slightly, I'm not one of these people who thinks that the policy pre-2010 was hugely over-relaxed on the fiscal side. I think it was a bit over-relaxed on the fiscal side. And I think that was possible because the markets knew that the bank would prevent demand from getting out of hand.
Now, I've not forgotten there was a question that I did accept. If you can ask it very, very quickly.
It was basically the same question.
Great, even better.
He wants his cup of tea.
That's fine. As you can see, normally I pride myself on my timekeeping, but I'm just completely out of my depth here. Thank you very much, panel. I thought that was wonderful. Thank you. Do join us for a cup of tea. We'll be back in about 20 minutes.
Thank you very much indeed for everybody staying along for the second half. We're very pleased you enjoyed your cup of tea. The thing about the Strand Group at King's is that it's both about studying and talking about and understanding contemporary history and establishing relationships with government departments and more widely to understand that history, but also about applying that learning, and applying that learning both supporting government departments themselves so that they can educate the next generation of civil servants and more widely, but also to contribute to the policy debate. And so having had on this 20-year anniversary a discussion about what happened 20 years ago, the second part of our discussion is more contemporary. What's been happening to the Bank of England in recent years, given the reforms which have been put in place at the end of the decade and the first few years of this new decade, and also the ongoing challenges post-financial crisis that the Bank of England faces. So we're hoping that we're going to have that discussion informed by the history, but also in this session to look forward a little bit to see where monetary and wider macro-prudential policy and the institution is going to go. Now, really sadly, I've moved a chair to behind the screen so as not to empty chair the Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, Sir John Cunliffe, who is the ultimate poacher turned gamekeeper, because having terrorised the Bank of England for many years at the Treasury, he then jumped ship and became a Deputy Governor at the Bank of England, but for Purdah rules, it was decided that John couldn't speak today. He was very apologetic indeed, but he is coming along for the evening, and I think the good news is that the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, is also coming along to the drinks reception to say a few words after this session. So don't interpret this as any way as this is, I'm afraid, an unfortunate consequence of the general election rather than anything else. However, we do have three participants in recent economic and financial events, including working closely with the Bank of England on the panel today. We have Nick Macpherson, the former Permanent Secretary of the Treasury, and now the Chair of, what was it again?
Hawes Bank.
Chair of Hawes Bank. Then we also have Shriti Vadera, a former Treasury Advisor, Biz Minister.
Cabinet Office.
Cabinet Office Minister, and also now another bank chair, but chair of Santander UK.
Thank you for remembering.
Good. And it's quite big, Santander. And that's why I remember his
Brindle's
name.
profitable.
But has not got as good a wine cellar. And then our third and our second discussant is Rupert Harrison. Is it Sir Rupert Harrison yet?
No, it is not.
That was Will Straw. It's Rupert Harrison, who was the advisor for many years to George Osborne, who I'm sure has turned down the opportunity to become the new business and economic columnist of the Evening Standard, because he's much too busy as a portfolio manager at BlackRock. But we're going to start with Nick, and we're talking about the Bank of England, today's challenges.
Thank you. I should say, actually, that Dr. Harrison was chairman of a fantastic Gordon Brown institution, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors. And indeed, I think the council may have met once or twice. But,
Both of them.
but just to go back to 1997, I feel obliged to set the record straight. Terence said that there were three people in the room when the piece of paper was handed over. I was Bernard to Terence's Sir Humphrey, and I was in the room taking the notes. This time, 20 years ago. Actually, my main memory of that was not that evening; it was the next morning, where I spent the last three and a half years working for Ken Clarke, who never had any meeting before 9:30 in the morning as a matter of principle. And I thought, the regime's changed. We're going to have to work on a weekend. And I better get in early. So I got in at 8 o'clock in the morning into Her Majesty's Treasury on, I guess, what was the 3rd of May, only to find that Gordon Brown had been there since 5:30. Security guard had to find a key to the Chancellor's room and let him in. Those were the days. It's interesting looking back on 20 years and in framing the future. In many ways, the history of independence, covers 2 decades. There was a period to 2007, and then there was the period from 2007 to 2017. The run on Northern Rock was in September 2007, so we'll soon be celebrating that happy anniversary. And in one sense, everything which has happened since the run on Northern Rock in terms of how the monetary and financial policy regime has been designed reflects the experience of the crisis which started in 2007, certainly went on through 2009, and some would argue has run on even longer. And I mean, what has informed successive attempts to reform the monetary and financial system has been the extraordinary events at the end of that decade, which showed that the 1997 settlement, though I would argue a distinct improvement on what had taken place before, it was, I think, found wanting. Whether that was due to the legislative framework, the institutions themselves, or the personalities of some of the key players, I think is difficult to answer with complete confidence. I suspect there are aspects of each of these things. I mean, what was striking, and when you talk to, I don't know, people, say, who were involved in the same sort of things in Canada or Australia, is that the institutions worked as a team in those countries. I think my recollection of 2008-9 was that establishing teamwork, creating a sort of team approach to solving the financial crisis was quite difficult. There followed a series of reforms. Actually, it's the nature of politics. Politics is always all about difference, and you know, new governments get elected and they're scrapping a whole lot of things and changing things. It's almost always they start on the deck chairs, because the deck chairs are the easiest things to change. Actually changing the substance is always far more difficult. But what's striking, actually going really back to the early 90s, is how incremental reform to the Bank of England has been. Just as operational independence followed on from some of the reforms Ken Clarke put in place, what's striking is actually that Alistair Darling put in a series of changes, in particular in the 2009 Banking Act, and then George Osborne, following 2010 election, built on those, and perhaps most significant was the abolition of the FSA, which was, I think, inevitable. I think it's fair to say the FSA, like just about everybody else, failed to recognise the build-up of risk in the system, and it's in the nature of financial crises that whichever institution is in charge at the time, it is the one which tends to get clobbered. So just as the changes in 1997 reflected the experience with Johnson Matthey, BCCI and Barings, so did the changes in following 2010 election reflect you know, who was in charge in the run-up to the crisis. And you know, at some point, almost certainly there will be another financial crisis. You don't have crises unless people don't see them coming. So it's bound to be on something probably different from last time round, and no doubt at that point the Bank of England will be reformed again. That's politics. And now look, that could happen next year. More likely it'll happen in 20 years' time or 100 years' time, depending on the extent of the crisis. So I don't think we should get too sentimental about these things. But I think where we are is in a better place. I mean, what was really striking, certainly when the run on Northern Rock happened, that there was provision for emergency liquidity assistance, but there wasn't much provision for anything else in terms of resolving Northern Rock. And actually, one of the slightly strange things through 2008 was whenever a bank collapsed, which they did with some regularity from the summer of 2008, the Bank of England, for various reasons, did not act as the Treasury's agent in resolving banks. Actually, it was left to the Treasury. My favourite recollection of 2008 was when the Icelandic banks collapsed, and it became necessary for Tom Scholar to set up a company in the middle of the night, appoint some lawyer as a secretary to the company, and take over all the Icelandic banks. I found that slightly puzzling at the time because I thought, the clue's in the name, the Bank of England's a bank, surely it would operate as our agent, but it didn't. Anyway, subsequently, I think Mr. Osborne put the resolution framework in a better place. We do have a new memorandum of understanding, which sought, at least in part, to answer the question, who is in charge in a crisis? This was something which certainly George Osborne felt strongly about, and certainly having experienced trying to corral some of my colleagues in the various institutions in 2008-9, I felt was very important indeed. I mean, if you want to quibble with the MOU, the question is, what triggers the process whereby the Chancellor takes charge and can seek to direct the bank. My recollection is it requires the bank to take a view that taxpayers' money is going to be put at risk. It is possible to conceive of circumstances where the Treasury might take a view earlier in a process, in a crisis, that it wants to take charge. Of course, I mean, there's always been provision in the Act for, even following operational independence, for the Chancellor to direct the Bank of England. The problem in 2008, we did look at that from time to time, and Alistair Darling was interested in whether that was an option. The problem at that point for the Treasury was, this was in relation to liquidity, that you kind of had to know, you had to have the expertise to know what you were directing the bank to do. So liquidity is quite an arcane issue, the provision thereof, and getting into the level of detail where the Treasury is actually itemising precisely what haircut you're going to apply to what asset in pumping liquidity in exchange for those assets is quite difficult. But actually, I think, I just wanted to raise those issues, but I think the other thing which I think has got more interesting the longer the crisis has gone on are issues around macro-prudential policy and the interaction between monetary and fiscal policy. So just to cover off macro-prudential, I mean, macro-prudential is not new. Actually, some of the Barber boom in the early 70s was created by attempts at that time to implement a policy of special deposits and reserve asset ratios. The problem at that time was the shadow banking of the day were things called certificates of deposit, and there was an extraordinary loophole where certificates of deposit weren't in the system. There was an extraordinary amount of round tripping, and the money supply increased by 25% a year. And so I think macroprudential is definitely the right direction to go in. It is separate from monetary policy, but you've got to approach it with a degree of realism. And I welcome the Bank of England's interest in shadow banking, because actually without that, without continually trying to identify what the shadow banking of the day is, I fear macroprudential policy will just encourage disintermediation. Easy to talk about, and the Bank of England, I mean, it's easy to make speeches about shadow banking, actually very difficult to track it down and regulate it. But a sensible part of the toolkit and an important reform. I think that the challenge around the relationship with fiscal has come up recurringly since 2008. the reality is, and there are people in this room who've been pointing this out for years, is when the financial and monetary system is under stress, what actually does it's not so much monetary conditions which matter, it's credit. And the problem which successive governments faced between 2008 and 2012 was, how do you make the transmission mechanism between loose monetary conditions and supportive credit conditions work? And there were various attempts. And starting with the Special Liquidity Scheme and Credit Guarantee Scheme, then there was a period when the Treasury had to design its own system under George Osborne, which is another sort of set of letters, the NLGS, I can't even remember, Rupert will remember what it stood for. And then finally the bank adopted the Funding for Lending scheme. And it's in the nature of these things that they are at the interface between monetary and fiscal policy, because the bank is understandably reluctant to take on too much risk when it comes to the private sector. And historically, the Treasury's room for manoeuvre has been limited by perfectly sensible state aid rules. It's an interesting question for the future, that leaving the European Union, whether I would hope that the government of the day, whoever that is, will try and replicate some sort of state aid regime. But in doing so, it may want to take a good hard look at how the regime applies to monetary and credit policy. I mean, the other blindly obvious point is that quantitative easing very rapidly gets into issues of fiscal policy, and therefore much greater coordination is necessary between the Treasury and the Bank of England, I think, than was anticipated back in 1997. As when you're at the so-called zero bound, having sensible conversations about the direction of macroeconomic policy becomes pretty essential. I mean, so far, I think when it comes to QE, and no doubt there's a diversity of views in this room about how effective QE is, I've always been rather more sceptical than most. But assuming it does work, you know, you do need it does need to be underpinned by the Treasury, and actually, to be fair to George Osborne and Alistair Darling, they've always been very happy to give the Bank of England what it wants in this territory. With hindsight, could the bank have been more active in buying private assets, as I think the Fed was in the States? This is dangerous territory if you're a central banker. You really don't want to be buying up private assets which could end up being worthless. On the other hand, if you do want to have quite a big effect, it may be necessary. And more recently, I think the bank has been more active in that space, and I would personally welcome that. Of course, we haven't, since the crisis, seen a failure of any great size. Since the Bank of England took responsibility for resolution, I think only 2 companies have failed. One was Dunfermline Building Society, which was just after the legislation was put in place. Latterly, the South Sea Mortgage and Investment Company failed in 2011. Great name, South Sea. But we haven't seen it tested properly. We haven't seen, we haven't had conditions, thank God, where the Chancellor's had to take control in a crisis, and we will see how things work when it happens. Just to finish off, I guess the question I would like to end up with is, I mean, one thing is certain, is we have made the Bank of England a far more powerful institution than it was even in 1997. There is an extraordinary concentration of power within it. Interestingly, one of the changes which happened in 2016, it's in the nature of this period that all chancellors end up reforming their own reforms, is that the Prudential Regulatory Authority, which originally Mervyn King and George Osborne were quite keen to keep at arm's length from the bank, it was going to be part of the bank but separate, has been fully integrated into the bank's structure. I can totally understand why. This was largely in response to requests from the Bank of England, the latest bunch of reforms. And in many ways, those changes made good sense because it's actually very difficult to run the Bank of England given how many responsibilities it's got. So trying to simplify the structure, trying to reduce the number of committee meetings, trying to make some of those committee meetings more transparent, I think makes perfectly good sense. But what it does do, when you combine it with the creation of many more deputy governors, it does concentrate an extraordinary amount of power in the hands of the governor. And also, I think it's fair to say that with the proliferation of independent committees in the bank, the role of the independent external member has potentially been weakened simply because inevitably, if you're on the Monetary Policy Committee, you have less sight of what's going on in the rest of the bank, whereas the executive of the bank, and in particular the governor, has complete sight of what is going on. Now, fortunately, and I'm not just saying this because he's going to be here later, actually, I think this regime has worked extraordinarily well under my old friend Mark Carney. I think he brought a lot of good practice from Canada, and he also is a master of managing relationships. And, dining with Dr. Carney and George Osborne, which Rupert and I did on a regular basis, was always a pleasure. My worry, though, is that regimes which are built and work around one individual can sometimes become less effective under different management. And I guess, at some point in the future, this regime will be tested. It will almost certainly, since Mark said he's off in the fairly near future, that failure will come under a different governor. And I suppose it just may be the caution of a long-standing Treasury official whether there are enough checks and balances in the system, or whether we have created an office which will produce latter-day Montague Normans. Time will tell.
Thank you very much indeed, Nick. Excellent as always. So the first discussant, we'll go to the undoubted architect of the reforms, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisers, former, Mr. Harrison.
Do you want me to go and stand up, or should I think I'll
Totally
stay
up to
here.
you. You'd be the first person not to go to the podium.
Happy to be the first person.
But that's okay.
No, I haven't prepared kind of long remarks, but I thought I'd make a few points, and Nick has also reminded me of a couple of things that I've scribbled down some notes about, so I'll try and include those as well. I think Nick's already touched on, the theme of all these discussions, which is about whether personnel is more important than structures. And in the end, I think that it's almost a truism, but I think it's certainly true that no structure is robust to all personnel choices. And so, a lot of I unfortunately missed the last session, but a lot of the, battle stories that you picked up in the Treasury on entering in 2010 of the crisis period came down to personnel issues. But equally, I think that, a good set of personnel and crucially good relationships between those personnel can probably overcome any structure, however convoluted. Certainly the US system, when you look at how it's designed, is a total mess, and yet has at various times managed to achieve decent outcomes. But similarly, I think no amount of institutional checks and balances can overcome a kind of groupthink that overtakes an entire profession and an entire kind of group of policymakers and participants. However, I do think, and on personnel issues, I think that there's an obligation on the people who hold those offices to put those relationships front and centre. Certainly, George Osborne's view was always that. In fact, Nick, you were one of these. George always took the view that if you're the Chancellor of the Exchequer, it is your first responsibility to maintain 3 good relationships, as with your Permanent Secretary, Prime Minister, and the Governor of the Bank of England. And no matter how difficult those individuals are, it's important that you maintain the good relationships. Luckily, with 2 of those at least, that was always relatively easy.
He didn't include the Shadow Chancellor.
I don't know, did he? It varied. No, I think that was normally on a relatively good, but yeah, certainly a distant 4th, I suspect. Unfortunately. But I do think that, having said that, so I think personnel clearly matters, but having said that, just I thought I'd go through some of the thinking around structures that I think have been borne out and were borne out by the crisis and by the experience since, and just a couple of the insights that we developed in opposition and then put into practice after 2010. I think there were really 3 insights which related to 2 institutions which were, I think, at the core of the reforms. The first set related to supervision of banking and the lender of last resort, and I think that, so this was a lot, we did a lot of thinking in 2009, 2010, in the run-up to government. We spoke to a lot of people. Of course, we had the benefit of hindsight and being able to be observers of much of the crisis and what had happened. And we also had a lot of time to speak to a lot of people, and we did speak to a lot of academics and central bankers and practitioners, which certainly informed these views. I think when it came to the creation of the PRA, so obviously a big part of the reform was splitting prudential supervision out of the FSA, putting it back into the Bank of England. Actually, from memory, the desire to have the PRA as a sort of arm's length subsidiary was very much Mervyn's desire. It was not part of the original model. I think it was at least as much to do with the practicalities of contracts, pay levels, and the practicalities of managing what was a very, very different institution to the bank, and the management challenge emerging, I think, was a big part of that. And so I think the 2016 reform is a big improvement. But the 2 real insights underlying the PRA. One was, I think, revealed by the crisis, which is that it is fundamentally a good idea for the lender of last resort to be the same institution that is also the prudential supervisor of the banks. Just because when it comes to the crunch, having that, the deep knowledge of those balance sheets and the trust in the analysis of those balance sheets massively enables the ability to carry out the function of lender of last resort, and indeed to be the kind of the resolution authority if it comes to it. So I think that is something that I think has been applied not just in the UK since then, but in other countries. I think it was extremely, it's easy to forget now, but it was extremely controversial. So when we came out with proposals to abolish the FSA and put supervision back in the Bank of England, it was by no means the consensus view. I think there was a lot of people who thought this was purely political desire to be seen to be abolishing the FSA, which obviously was a kind of creation of Ed and Gordon, and we were trying to win an election. And of course that overlapped with the policy, as a lot of good policies do overlap with good politics when you can persuade politicians to put them forward. But I think there was I think there is a deep underlying truth that the lender of last resort should be combined with the prudential supervisor. I also think there's a second insight was about culture, which again was relatively controversial, but I think has become consensus certainly in this country and certainly in the Bank of England, which is that combining into one institution the culture of a prudential supervisor and a consumer and conduct regulator naturally leads the latter to dominate, because consumer and conduct regulation are more high profile most of the time. They have a much more short-termist culture. The press are most of the time much more interested in them, and it becomes the kind of hot part of that institution to be in was consumer and conduct and not supervision, and particularly a culture of judgment-based supervision that was not purely about kind of box ticking, which is a slightly derogatory way to describe how it was done, but I think that's the kind of characterisation was a fault of the way of putting them together. Now, that's not to say that the FSA wasn't a huge improvement over what had gone before, but I think there was a benefit to splitting the PRA out. And I think that has been a particularly successful part of the reforms, that the culture of the PRA has, I think, borne that out, that it is a much more judgmental institution and the ability to kind of take a more longer-term view and kind of operate supervision in a different way to regulation. So I think those are the two insights that underpin the PRA. And then I think the third insight was, not a particularly controversial one, was through the creation of the FPC, which was something that we committed to in 2008. Actually, not that anyone noticed, but was part of things we put out in opposition. And I think that the simple thing there is just that it turned out that it was probably a good idea to have a group of people who were explicitly and publicly accountable for financial stability. Now, that's not to mean that group of people are not going to be subject to groupthink, and of course you want to put lots of checks and balances in there to try and minimise that risk. But no one will now be able, if we, the next financial crisis, we will know who to blame. There is a group of people whose explicit role is to monitor emerging financial stability risks and who have a set of tools to deal with those risks. And if they feel they don't have the tools necessary, are very able to speak out publicly and say so. So I think that those reforms are not just shifting the deck chairs, because I think they play to how individuals will behave if you create a culture of an institution, if you give people explicit public accountability. And the basic structure of those reforms, I think, has stood the test of time. Now, of course, it has not been tested in a crisis, and so the judgment will come when it is. But I think we're at least given ourselves a kind of better shot of having an institution that can respond. A couple of comments about, we do hear a lot, I think that the critique that, you've put a lot of power in the Bank of England, and particularly in the hands of the governor. I don't really buy this. I certainly think you put a lot of power in the Bank of England as an institution made up of different parts of the institution, the MPC, the FPC, the PRA board, etc. But I find it hard to reconcile a critique that the governor is very powerful, which is often made at the same time that there are an awful lot of committees. And indeed, I hope you won't mind me revealing this, for one of those early dinners after Mark Carney arrived in the job, and had sort of got his head around the new structure that he was being asked to take over, he said, you really have designed a lot of committees for me. And I think that was quite alien to him coming from the Bank of Canada, where the governor basically was in charge and could basically do what he wanted. And I think that speaks to the fact there is a system of checks and balances within the Bank of England, and the governor, while it's true that the banking executive have the kind of look-through ability to link things across different areas of the bank's responsibility, it's not just the fiefdom of the governor, and the governor quite often has found it quite difficult to get his way on various committees and boards, whether that's the PRA board, the FPC or the MPC. So I think that I don't quite buy that critique. I think the thing that Nick reminded me of that I think has not been resolved, and I'm not sure is totally resolvable, is this issue of the kind of overlap of monetary and fiscal policy. So the experience of credit easing in 2011, 2012 was extremely frustrating. So we, after the Eurozone crisis blew up in August 2011, we were of the view that financial conditions in the UK were far too tight. We were frustrated that the bank was insisting on continuing to run down the SLS at a time when that might not be ideal, and we wanted to do credit easing. We had a lot of conversations, and we essentially came to a complete dead end and ended up announcing the National Loan Guarantee Scheme, which was, really, a circular scheme that was trying to do something that EU state aid rules prevented the Treasury from doing. So we were trying to change the price and availability of credit relative to current market pricing, and the EU state aid rules explicitly forbade the Treasury from changing a market price. And so I think there is an interesting angle there potentially. But of course the problem was that there was the Treasury trying to do it, whereas it should have been the central bank. And through a lot of efforts of ourselves, and this is where it comes back to personnel, explicitly through getting on board Adair Turner, Paul Tucker, and particularly Charlie Bean, I think deserves a lot of credit during that period, for finally getting Mervyn to a place where we could announce the FLS, which had all these kind of clever incentives designed into it, the funding for lending scheme that I think gave cover for that. This was basically just term funding for banks, which was what was needed. The fact that it had all sorts of incentives to encourage lending was really the kind of political cover that made it acceptable and wasn't just seen as a kind of subsidy to the banking system. Now, I think that that pattern has not been repeated. We're now in a much better place. Of course, we have new personnel. We have now a system where the MPC and the FPC meet regularly and discuss these issues. We tweaked the MPC remit in 2013 that now has kind of explicit reference to extraordinary measures and kind of cooperation with the Treasury where kind of fiscal, where there are fiscal implications. I think it's still perfectly possible that you could run into similar difficulties if you had a situation where the senior leadership of the bank took a fundamentally different view to the Treasury. I'm not sure you could design a system to avoid that, because in the end, if the bank disagrees with the analysis and doesn't think that credit conditions are too tight or too loose, that's the Bank of England, and you've created it to do that. So I don't think you can design away that conflict, and I think we at least have a better system whereby you're more likely to at least be able to air that conflict and have systems that can resolve it. But I don't think there's any kind of perfect answer to that. Those are my comments.
Brilliant. The Chairman of Santander.
Well, I think unlike every other panellist so far, I probably wasn't, I wasn't at the creation of either system, in fact, present. So on the other hand, I've had to deal with the consequences of both, one in government during the financial crisis, and the second now, of course, as chairman of a bank. So I don't know if that makes me more objective or more biased, but we'll see. I have to say I think the current system works well, being on the receiving end of it, so to speak. I think it works well, in particular the prudential with the, within the Bank of England. And I also think that it is really good to have the FCA driving a focus on conduct and culture issues in the banking sector, which I'm reasonably clear would not be happening at the scale and the pace that they're happening without it. It's fair to say that I think some of it is really to do with understanding the experience of the past and having the right leadership. I think we've really got world-class leadership at the top of the three, the Bank of England, the PRA, and the FCA. And I do agree with the points that have been made about, is it really individuals, resource management, culture within a regulatory organisation, or is it the structure? And you saw during the financial crisis that we saw, frankly, a little bit of both, and there was definitely a who do you call question. And I remember in 2007 being a whole bunch of telephone calls coming in, sort of saying, first, who do we speak to? Which part of the organisation do we speak to? And I was at the time, by the way, the Minister for International I was a minister in the Department for International Development, and the second thing they would say would be, what are people thinking, around you? And I'm going, I'm in Addis Ababa, they're not thinking anything about Northern Rock, actually. So it was definitely a sort of who do we call question. But having said that, I do think that there was a huge element of people's views. So it was not as if the Bank of England was unaware of the views of the FSA or indeed the Treasury, but their primary focus was moral hazard. I mean, Mervyn King talked about moral hazard, mentioned moral hazard 15 times at his Treasury Select Committee hearing in September of 2007. That was the view. It was not that he was, it was not that they were unaware that there was, a financial stability issue. So I think it's very hard that when we think through to the future, that we are more pragmatic and than ideological, as Nick said, and secondly, that we think to solving the future, not the past problem. And my concern is that the future problem is not going to come from any of the things that we've, frankly, particularly solved. Kate mentioned the fiscal and monetary coordination in zero bound, as did Nick. I think it's very important to roll into that the coordination with macroprudential and to prevent sort of the risks around financial repression. And Ed, you wrote a great paper on how you could possibly deal with that. I would only express some nervousness about the fact that we are going to have 4 of the governors of the major central banks of the world, which is sort of in order, Yellen, Kuroda, Carney, and then Draghi, coming to the end of their terms within an 18-month period of each other, starting next year. And outside of this room, it's fair to say that this is not an environment for the most nuanced of debates out there. And so I would be a little nervous about sort of raising the spectre of lots of reform in the current environment. And I'm also nervous, Nick, you said that if you could see a crisis, then it wouldn't happen. I'm not sure about that, because I'll tell you, we have to go back to why does politics outsource some decision-making to independent experts? Ed, you talked about credibility. Terry talked about, that you didn't want to, they didn't want to because they didn't want to be seen to have failed. But, politics is not actually set up to make a good trade-off in the risk-cost curve, particularly if it's a future risk against a present cost. It just, doesn't work because it's really hard to prove the counterfactual to the public and say they don't reward you for prevention. I mean, that's how it works. So when you're outsourcing your political decision, in order to create the transparency and the accountability that we're all talking about, how do you create the transparency and why is the central bank so powerful without being accountable? You have to be able to define its political mandate with absolute precision, which is fine if it's inflation targeting. You have got breadth and depth and history of evidence. It's quite difficult when you come to macroprudential because the evidence is complex, sketchy. When you pull a lever, you don't know what the outcome is. You're not certain about the outcome. When it comes to the symptoms that you're seeing, you're not really sure what problem it's pointing to. So I quite like the solution, by the way, that you've got in your paper, Ed, which is saying you can't define the outcome, so the political mandate should be defined by a process that involves the politicians. And I think that's not a bad thing, but I would be more, you've got a sort of a trade-off decision made with everybody in the room, maybe chaired by a chancellor or something like that, and then you provide an operationally independent FPC, the FPC, a mandate. I would sandwich them even further. I would politically constrain even further and have something at the beginning which is independent and separated out as a function to identify systemic risks like IMF surveillance or the OBR or something like that. And then you have the political trade-off that is essential because in the end macroprudential goes to distribution in politics and the restriction of lending to certain income groups, and it is a deeply political decision. And then you operationally sort of outsource again. Now it's complex, and that's why I would be nervous in the current environment, because this is not a time for enormous amounts of complexity. I think the other area that I am looking forward to future reforms that I worry about is to make sure that the Twin Peaks model that we now have does not run the risk of becoming essentially multi-peak rather than twin peak, because quite honestly, we are in a situation where the whole of the financial system is having to simultaneously implement regulations from multiple sources at the same, at a time when we are undertaking a lot. And I think it leads to a sort of degree, the pace and the flow of the regulation coming through is such that it's going to lead to degrees of operational risk and financial strain that concern me. And I'll give you an example. There are currently 17 initiatives on payment systems. You've got the CMA and the payment service regulator doing separate ones on competition. You've got the Bank of England on real-time gross settlement system updating. You've got 3 EU directives on payments and anti-money laundering. You've got a payment strategy forum setting up a new strategy for payments. You've got the Treasury driving check imaging and a payment system operator. And by the way, we're going to implement all of this while we're doing ring fencing and doing Brexit. So you should be worried about financial strain, operationally speaking. It's not, the same, by the way, would apply to mortgages, where we've got multiple initiatives around from the FPC and the PRA and the FCA. All of them laudable, most of them necessary. I'm a fan, but they're just not necessarily prioritised. And having had to clear up the mess of a financial crisis, I have to say, I am in favour of stringent regulation. I just don't think that stringently regulated is the same thing as complicatedly regulated. And that would be, for me, maybe, Ed, when you stop sort of dancing around things, you could consider a sort of process around...
Never stop.
Below the belt?
You should consider... the thing we might want to do is think through the formalisation of coordination between the regulatory bodies that is about the pace and the prioritisation and the cumulative, in fact, and sometimes contradictory sort of impacts. I would say that the 2 areas of reform are one around coordination of the financial services regulatory piece, and the second around thinking through fiscal, monetary and macroprudential and zero bound, but let's just be really careful about not touching independence too much at such a fraught time.
And how much will Brexit complicate this?
Well, if you were a retail only, domestic sort of only banking or insurance entity, of course, in the longer term, I don't think you can touch very much immediately. In the longer term, you have the potential not to reduce, I hope ever, but to simplify. But I think if you are a part of the capital markets ecosystem, which at the end of it is the creator of, this is where our trade, so we get a trade surplus from the EU is in this area. This is the biggest sort of export, essentially, to the EU. I think it's going to be hugely complicating because we're going to have to be equivalent, so we can't get away from EU regulation. We might even need to be duly supervised by both sides, doubly supervised by both sides, because from the European perspective, they have a dependency on an existentially important service to their economy, so they need prudential sort of assurance. And it's systemically important to the UK economy, so we need assurance, so we're going to be supervised twice. This is all going to happen in a not just untested, but an entirely unprecedented type of relationship. So I think it'll be enormously complicated. Of course, we may not get access, and then it'll be quite simple, really.
Thanks, Shruti. Given we've got John Cunliffe's not here, can I abuse the chair and do 2 minutes on what we would have done if we'd won the election in 2015? Because I sort of think it sort of fits into Rupert's... Interestingly, by the way, did an event at Harvard 3 weeks ago where Larry Summers spoke for 25 minutes after our presentation in front of a big audience, public audience, all about why he doubted whether or not central bank independence was really relevant for the modern world, for a whole series of different arguments, and at the end of it said, but by the way, he said, with Donald Trump as president and Janet Yellen at the Fed, I think we should touch nothing at all and leave everything as it is, which is exactly the point you were making. The interesting thing is that the last week from the White House and from Congress, there was the beginning of what could become a public assault on the FSOC, which is actually interestingly the one part of the US regulatory reform since 2010, which maybe we ought to look at, because the Fed undoubtedly lacks the bank's prudential tools, but the one thing that you have in the FSOC is a coordinating Treasury-led, across regulators mechanism for having that conversation about your systemic or your objectives in a world where you can't specify an inflation target. And I think that is, so if we'd won the election in 2015, we would absolutely not have changed the PRA, Twin Peaks, or the FCA. I think there was no going back to either pre-97 or post-97 would have been the wrong thing to have done. But I think at the moment, the relationship between the Treasury and the Bank of England, from my point of view, is 2 arms length, and actually not necessarily because you want the Treasury to have more control, but to go to a point Nick said, if there is a future problem in our financial system, an institution will get the blame. And at the moment, the only institution which will get any blame is the Bank of England, because things are so concentrated, and there is actually a good government case for a bit of diversification of risk and a bit of sort of collective sharing of the problem, which the current system doesn't do. I think there's 3 other things which would have worried me if I'd come in 2015 as Chancellor. One is Nick's point about the relationship between the MPC and the FPC, because it's not totally clear they are really aiming for different objectives. There may be different versions of the same objective. Maybe, though, the MPC objective is the interest rate is always the more immediate and sexy lever, and there's a danger that the FPC work becomes sidelined. But there's also, as Nick said, a danger that the MPC and FPC external members are weaker in this process than the internal members. They actually have a system in Singapore where there is an MPC and the FPC, but any member of the MPC can at any time of their choosing trigger a joint meeting of both committees if they feel that they are being excluded from an important conversation on the financial policy side, say, which might have a bearing on the target for which they are accountable. And there's no doubt in certain circumstances you could have decisions being made in the FPC which could impact upon the Monetary Policy Committee's objective or vice versa. The thing I've always been worried about is the trigger point that Nick talked about as well. And it's actually, and this is absolutely tied up to personnel, which is that in a world in which the head of the PRA is really worried, and the head of the PRA as Deputy Governor goes to the Governor of the Bank of England and says, I'm really worried, and the Governor says, well, look, I'm the Governor, I think moral hazard's really important, I've heard what you've said, but go back to the PRA because we've sort of concluded we are where we are. I would think in that circumstance as Chancellor, I would want to know from the head of the PRA what they're worried about. And I think at the moment in the MOU, this is so still personalised between the Governor and the Chancellor. And actually, I think the MOU says the Chancellor, the Governor, and such ad hoc committees that they may set up from time to time. Personally, I would prefer pre-crisis and then into a crisis, a structure where the Governor's in charge, but you're absolutely hearing from the PRA or the FCA head or whatever as part of that conversation structurally, rather than, because I can just tell you, we talked about the war game earlier, you can end up in a situation where a governor wants to be the sole voice of the institution. And when you have so much power and overlapping and maybe conflicting objectives within one institution, it's quite important that there is more than one personal statutory centre, and the Chancellor can hear from more than one point of view from within that institution. And a more arm's-length PRA made that more possible, and bringing the PRA into the Bank of England structure as much, in the end, if the Governor says to these deputies, I've heard what you're saying, but actually that's not where we are, at the moment that's sort of the end of the story. And it is possible to deal with that personnel issue through structural change so that people have legitimate voices as well as the governors. And my sense at the moment is we don't have that. But I think of those as being evolutions, a UK FSOC, thinking about the MPC-FPC relationship and voice with it amongst the deputy governors as evolutions of your reforms rather than fundamental challenges to them.
Can I come back on some of those?
Of course.
I mean, I think there's always a case for making changes around the edges. I mean, I was always normally, I think, biased on the side of, if it ain't broke, don't try to fix it.
Well, it's not broke yet.
Well, exactly. But I mean, on some of those points, I think, it's true that the Bank of England are institutionally set up to take the blame. The FPC are accountable for financial stability. But I think you would agree that in the end, if you had a financial crisis, the idea that the Chancellor of the Exchequer will be able to turn up to Parliament and say, well, it's not my fault, it's the Bank of England, is not realistic. And so any Chancellor is going to have a massive incentive to get all over the Bank of England if they think there are concerns. On the FPC and the MPC, look, if you get specific about this, imagine there was a scenario in which the FPC were extremely worried about financial stability, we're taking some tightening actions that the MPC felt made it harder to hit their inflation objective. I think with the current setup, with both overlapping membership and the role of Treasury observers on both committees, the idea that would just happen without some kind of attempt to get people in a room, and the FPC and MPC already meet regularly, you can't legislate for every eventuality, and if that was happening, it probably would speak to some broader systemic issue in the economy that would need to be coordinated. I think the idea that the system would not be able to deal with that is unlikely, given as I say, the overlap in personnel and the sort of regular interaction. And then on the PRA chair not having a voice, so the PRA chair is a member of the Financial Policy Committee and is individually accountable for the actions of that committee, and therefore I think would be very able to make his or her concerns clear on that committee. The Treasury are observers in that committee, and I think ultimately there would be a pretty foolish Chancellor who refused a request for a meeting from the chair of the PRA because the governor didn't want him to meet him. So I think the system has.
The head of the PRA could ask for a meeting. The governor could say, "I don't want you to have the meeting." It would happen anyway.
Yeah, if I was
under this government, I'm sure you're right.
I cannot imagine a Chancellor of the Exchequer refusing to meet the chair of the PRA if he asked to see him. I think that would be an extremely foolish thing to do. Even if that were to happen, I think the fact that the chair of the PRA could make his concerns or her concerns very clear on the FPC, and that would get back to the Chancellor through the fact that the Treasury are observers on that committee. So again, I think the system is, more robust than it can be characterised. And the idea that the governor is the sole voice, I tell the current governor that he is the sole voice of the Bank of England, and he'll laugh. I think people have a lot of fun writing about all the speeches made by FPC members, NPC members. They are all individually accountable for their input on those committees. So I just think that the system is, once you've got the basic building blocks maybe there are cases for some of those changes, but there's quite a lot of flexibility to deal with difficult situations.
So, questions, comments? There's a microphone just coming down. Who's going to be the next one as well, just so we can sort of jump over there? That's Mark. Hello.
Can you hear me?
Yep. Yes.
Charles Moore from the Telegraph. Is it better to have, I'd like to ask a very simple question from the point of view of the public as opposed to experts about the changes that have taken place, which is really that once upon a time in the 1980s, nobody knew who that governor of the Bank of England was, and now they do, the public. And how good is that and how bad? If you create independence, you do something which in a way is very, very good, because you appear to take all of the very important decisions out of politics. But, of course, when a crisis comes, you give a sort of political authority to the person who's been taken out of politics. And this is dangerous if he doesn't agree with the government, and it's dangerous if he does agree with the government. So in the case of Irving King, it's getting a bit dangerous that he didn't agree with the government. And so eventually came along George Osborne chose Mark Carney, in fact made quite a political choice in choosing, in the sense that this was a man who would do the sort of thing he wanted done, which is in a way very reasonable. He doesn't want to appoint a man who's going to do what he doesn't want done. But you can see how it starts to move. And so then you get into this extraordinary situation in which in two referendums, the governor of the Bank of England becomes a sort of human shield for the politicians who are trying to win the referendum, and comes forward and tells the Scots how they got to vote. In my view, you're right about that. And then comes and tells the whole of the United Kingdom how they should vote, and in my view, he's wrong. But the point is that then this person accrues this incredible amount of authority. And I genuinely don't know in my own mind whether this is good because obviously he does accrue more trust than an average politician, or bad because it's a very undemocratic way of proceeding.
Nick?
Well, I remember sitting in a room with Eddie George and Ken Clark, where Ken Clark told Eddie George precisely what you have just said, Charles, which is you do realise, now we're going to publish the minutes, you are going to become a national figure. I mean, my guess is, I wasn't there at the time, but my guess is Montague Norman, insofar as anybody in those days was a national figure, sort of verged on being a national figure in the 20s and 30s. So it's not without precedent. I mean, what you've identified, I think, is you know, the fundamental challenge of independent institutions. It's in the nature of independent institutions, in a sense. Politicians are basically saying, this is too hot an issue to handle. We know deep down you're going to get suboptimal decisions if politicians are, say, setting interest rates. So we're going to give it to somebody else. Coming back to what we were saying earlier, you know, the Bank of England is operationally independent. I would argue it is not fully independent. It's interesting how the sort of case law of bank operational independence has developed. Sometimes when I get irritated, I think that the Bank of England is quite self-obsessed, but actually it needs to be self-obsessed. It needs to have proper governance. Although it's very unfashionable to say so, the Court of the Bank of England is quite important in terms of ensuring that there is proper governance, there are proper behavioural rules, and that, in a sense, governors live up to those rules. So I think any governor has to be very, very careful about when they will get involved in politics. Look, I don't know, because it's one of those historical kind of factuals we'll never know. My guess is that Mervyn King would have been very, I know for a fact he would have been very reluctant to get involved in the Scottish referendum. My guess is he would have been reluctant to get involved in the EU referendum. Dr. Carney has chosen a different approach. You know, whether he's right or wrong, it's tempting which side of the argument you're on to think, you know, Scotland, good. But it's something which I think the Bank of England needs to continue to really think about. And from time to time, actually, government has got to remind independent officials that actually they're independent on monetary policy decisions and regulatory decisions. They just need to be a bit careful about stepping too far over the line.
It's possible, Charles, that in the EU referendum, given subsequent statements, you might have been rather more welcoming of the contributions of the previous governor of the Bank of England than the current one.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
might have a different view. Rupert?
I mean, I don't think we should, you know, avoid creating independent figures because we're worried about what they might say. You know, I think that they're just participants in the public debate. They are accountable to journalists and MPs on committees for their views in the same way as anyone else. Just because they're the governor of the Bank of England or the, you know, chair of the Office of Budget Responsibility doesn't make any difference. And in fact, the two examples you cite of those two referendums show that, you know, he didn't swing the vote. Yeah, he was on the winning side in his intervention in Scotland, but actually people didn't heed his warnings in the Brexit referendum, so, you know, he was just another participant. I think on balance, creating these independent institutions has in both, you know, if you take the Bank of England and the OBR as two examples, in both cases that has radically improved the transparency of the information available to the media and the public, whether it comes to the making of monetary policy or the underlying facts and figures that underpin fiscal policy. And so actually there's a huge benefit to the public of creating these independent institutions, as long as there is accountability and a framework. So, you know, the Bank of England is accountable for delivering objectives that politicians set and are themselves accountable for. So I don't see it that it's particularly a problem.
But do you think, Rupert, do you think if in the run-up to the 2010 election, the governor had made speeches saying that the opposition's plans were too tight, they would, you know, damage demand in the economy, and would be taking major risks. How would you have felt about that?
Well, obviously we would have been extremely frustrated because we were trying to win an election, but that doesn't necessarily mean it would have been bad for the public and political debate, because he would have been challenged on those views by members of Parliament and the media. Now, of course, I don't think we should give free rein.
It would have been bad. It would have been wrong for the governor to comment on your fiscal policy in 2009.
No, I was just about to say, I don't think we should give free rein to, I think people holding these positions obviously should be held accountable for not straying as far as possible into political territory. But, so Mark Carney, when it comes to the EU referendum, for example, I think it was very difficult for him to have said much less than he said, because this was an event that was going to impact the mandate he had been given by Parliament. He had been given a mandate to set monetary policy and deliver financial stability, and that he genuinely, and the people around him all genuinely thought that the outcome of the referendum would impact both those things, and therefore it would have been remiss of him not to comment. He didn't actually come out and say, I think you should vote Remain. And had he done, that would have been wrong. So I don't think we should give free rein to these people to do this. But on balance, I think that our public debate and the media are able to cope with these kind of interventions.
It's also not clear that a Nolan process of appointments is more democratic than politicians making these independent decisions. Let's take three. Mark, Lord Burns, and I'll take a third one.
Mark Vadera, Chairman of the City Government Policy Committee, and also Chairman of the Payment Systems. Can I follow what Tricky said and ask a question? It seems to me that political decisions have been outsourced too much to regulators, and regulators inevitably are going to lean towards, say, over-regulation, but wishing to prevent a calamity, quite likely that in wishing to prevent a calamity, if you go too far, you could prevent a lot of good things happening. And it seems to me we don't have a joined-up approach on many issues. And I'll take housing markets as one example. Government clearly thinks home ownership is a good thing, and being self-employed is a good thing. But regulators seem to think that making high percentage loans or lending to self-employed people is not a good thing. And there is therefore a conflict between the policies. Have we gone too far in outsourcing what should be political decisions to regulators?
Very interesting. Lord Burns? Third one, chappie in the white shirt.
It seems to me that there is still a great confusion about where the line of independence begins and stops when it comes to the government in these things. And indeed, I think in some of the comments that have been made, it seems to me in an area where there is statutory independence, it is very reasonable for our politicians to then say the government is criticised, that the government has statutory independence, it's up to him what he says. When the government crosses the line and says things that are not areas where they are statutory independence, there is still a temptation for politicians to say, look, the Bank of England is independent, and you must leave them to say what they will. And I think the distinction between what you describe as strategic independence, I suppose, and operational independence seems to be still very blurred and needs quite a lot more clarity into it. Otherwise, it damages the political debate. It appears to me that, my memory is that when the government was criticised over his remarks on Brexit, he was very quickly protected by some politicians to say that the government has statutory independence.
It's interesting. Chap here. You got my phone.
I guess it's a question about what it means to be operationally independent, if that has any problems. So if there's no consensus on certain economic policy or economics more generally, which I'd say is controversial, is it possible to have these sort of technocratic outcomes without having a democratic deficit?
It's interesting. So who wants to go first?
I think all three of you sort of asking the same question. Have regulators been given too much power? Is the line clear enough? Is there a democratic deficit? And the truth is we're just always going to be veering like this, wherever that line might be. And first, it's because, as you say, there's no economic consensus about some things, there is about other things. And if you cannot clearly define and precisely mandate, then you will have a problem around a democratic deficit and accountability issue. It's inevitable, But I would say to Mark, be careful what you wish for, because I'll tell you who I'd rather be regulated by, which is a regulator rather than, kind of MPs who have a quite different incentive structure. And I can tell you I would never, ever accuse the city of short-termism again after having been through government, because, I mean, that's sort of... you have to take a view about whose incentive structure at whatever point in time is going to work best, and putting aside, whether you agree with what they're doing to you or whether you agree with what they're saying at any point in time, which is always going to be difficult. I would still rather have independent regulators. I don't think we've crossed the line. I think where we have got problems is in coordination between them, coordination with the government, coordination with fiscal policy, and I think we could strengthen the accountability in particular of the court. You say it's very important, but it's not something that actually carries, even after the reforms that were brought in recently, a huge amount of sort of teeth. That really doesn't have it. And so if as the PRA does, look at corporate governance and come and do board effectiveness reviews and all sorts of other things to the banking system, I'd really like to see the Bank of England do that to itself, and then we'll see what we have to say about its governance and its accountability, and that could be an improvement. So I don't think you can define this precisely unless you can define the mandate precisely, and it's impossible to define the mandate precisely, possibly outside of the area of inflation targeting.
Let's take a few more questions and then we'll give everybody one more chance to do all in one go. Is that okay? There was a gentleman who had midway down the back who indicated earlier. But he's there. Is it the lady with the red blouse. Lady, hi.
No, not very well.
There we go. Now?
Yep.
Yeah, I think my question is a little bit similar to some of the earlier questions, but I wanted to take it a step further, which is to say, while many of us might prefer the decision of a regulator, when regulators step into areas that we see as essentially part of our democratic process and decision-making, and by this I'll take the example of the housing market again and macro-prudential policy. When regulators step into that area, is there then more chance that the independence of central banks in the area that is most needed, that is setting interest rates and monetary policy, will become more of a threat?
Right. Microphone? Yeah, definitely, sure. Thanks for another Baroness.
Margaret Jerry, House of Lords. This is really a question to, I hope, wind up the discussion. And you said at the beginning of this session, this particular part of the session, one of the reasons for this extremely interesting afternoon was to give some guidance, perhaps give some advice to people in the room, students and so on, who might take up the roles that you've all held. What would you say, out of the discussions that you've heard and the contributions you've made, would be the most important lessons? Are there such important lessons? Because, to be quite honest, many of the things I've heard seem to reflect both the frailty of the institutions we've been talking about, but more importantly, as Shriti said, that this is not a time for nuanced solutions, and also that so much depends on personalities. So is there guidance, or is it just a question of taking what you find?
Thank you, Margaret. Excellent question. Anybody else? So it's almost time for us to go and get a drink, which is great. Nick?
Well, to answer Margaret's question, I mean, today we've been discussing the frailties of the institutions, but one reason why Britain can still borrow very cheaply over much longer time periods than any other G7 country is that our institutions are ultimately very strong. It's easy to knock the Bank of England, and it's very good to see my old friend John Cunliffe coming in the room. And it's very easy to knock the Treasury as it was the FSA. But actually, we're not bad at these things. We do, as a country, occasionally stare into the abyss. We certainly did in '76. We did again briefly in 2008-9, but generally we're quite good at pulling back from it. And our institutions work well in a crisis. The basic problem with the institutions is that they're not so good at spotting the crisis and anticipating the crisis. What I would say in terms of today's discussion actually is you're never going to reach perfection in terms of how you organise these various functions. There are trade-offs. You know, treaties, you know, in one sense, it's very good having regulators all under one roof, because if you're a banker like, you know, Shriti and I now are, you know, you can just have one conversation. And believe me, those who say that we've ended tick box regulation should be at the sharp end of conversations with the regulators. So what you're trying to do is optimise across the frontier of possibilities where there are a whole lot of trade-offs. I don't think we're in a bad place. Like Shriti, actually, look, we've had about 17 acts in the last 10 years. Let's just let the system settle down. I don't think it's a bad system. I'm sympathetic to Ed's ideas of how you can improve it, and at some point we probably should. But I would say this is a time to let the system settle down and see how it works.
Rupert? I mean, I'd agree on the advice is, you know, yeah, don't do reform for reform's sake, and focus a lot on the individuals. And if you are appointing people to these positions, try and appoint people that you think will help the institutions function. I mean, I do strongly agree that I think our institutions are perceived as extremely strong, and I think they are extremely strong. I mean, we had that episode, you know, the fact that it became a sort of huge story that Theresa May, I believe through sort of misdrafting in her conference speech, was seen to have infringed marginally on the Bank of England's independence, became a huge story, and she had to row back from it. You know, I think it's testament to the fact that, you know, small infringements on the strength of our institutions are defended pretty robustly. So I think that I took that pretty comfortably. Just on this one point about this sort of democratic deficit and regulators that are kind of out of the control of democratically elected politicians. Yeah, I don't think I think we can get much too worried about this. You know, so to take the example of the housing market, you know, ultimately the politicians create the framework, and then it's a difference of time horizon. So for, you know, day to day, month by month, year by year, regulators might make decisions you know, through a framework that has been put in place by politicians. If the politicians over time don't like the outcome of those decisions, they can change the framework, or they can intervene through some other way. So if the government really does care about the self-employed, and given recent events you might question that, but if they really care about the self-employed and they're worried that it's too difficult for a self-employed person to get a mortgage, there are things they can do about it. Right? The right thing to do might not be to intervene with a regulator who's probably reacting, you know, in a quite a rational way to financial stability risks. If there's a real political case to help the self-employed, there's fiscal things you can do to help self-employed people get a mortgage. So politicians are still ultimately in control because they're accountable for the framework, they set the framework, and they have lots of other tools at their disposal. So I don't think we should get too hung up on these sort of unaccountable regulators. And then finally, on the sort of operational versus political independence, of course it was politically very convenient for lots of people who agreed with Mark Carney's point on the referendum to come in and say, well, you can't possibly criticise him, he's independent. It didn't stop lots of people criticising him, so I don't think it didn't make much difference. You know, I personally don't think I don't think he really stepped outside of the bounds of what was within his remit, because he was talking about things he should have talked about. But again, the fact that we had lots of people who did criticise him and he came in for a lot of flack, and the public were able to make their judgments, shows again that we have a system that's relatively robust to those things.
I want to just go back to the question from the lady about whether by giving the Bank of England a fuzzier mandate on something you can't define as clearly, you're compromising the mandate that you can define clearly. And of course, I think there is a huge risk around that. I just don't think that's a reason not to, because we've identified this as a risk. This is the best place for it to be dealt with, and therefore we've just got to make the system work better and work through some of the not significant systemic reforms, but the sort of marginal reforms around it. And Margaret, to the question of what would you say to a young person, I mean, yes, Nick is completely right that our institutions are incredibly strong, but also the calibre of the people that go into it are just extraordinary. And whatever we might say about the very shaky start that we had because we didn't have the right institutional structure at the start of the financial crisis during 2007, once we hit our stride, the response led by Tom Scholar and John Kingman was just extraordinary. And it was world-class, and it has been imitated everywhere, and people talk about it still. So, you know, if you want to have a career and you've minded with public service, do it. Don't worry about this stuff.
So I'm going to answer Baroness Jay's questions as well. So, and this is kind of from a personal perspective. So lessons for young people thinking about politics and policy. Always plan 5 to 10 years ahead, and never forget that today may be your last day. This is the Gordon Brown one. Never forget that it may well. No, never forget that it's almost certainly a cock-up, but never forget that it might be a conspiracy. Always learn the lessons of history, but never expect history to repeat itself. And then I think
You've got to end with the 3 letters.
Oh,
no. Always, if your chance, always get a good joke writer. But I think the other one is the quality of the people you appoint is more important than anything else. But it has to, as Rupert was saying, I think, happen within a kind of an environment of mutual respect and cooperation. And things go wrong when people try and do each other's jobs or in a non-respecting way. But respect and cooperation, mutual respect and cooperation, and getting the right people is the most important thing. And you've sort of heard that reflected from the others on the platform. Thank you very much indeed to Nick and Treaty and to Rupert. Thank you to John for presiding over this Strand Group event. Thank you to our sponsors. And thank you to all of you for coming along for this afternoon's event. And please do come and have a drink with Sir John Cunliffe, who's arrived, and you're very welcome. Thank you very much indeed.